Welcome. Before tonight's story begins, take a moment to get comfortable. Where are you listening from tonight? You're always welcome to share it in the comments. If these calm, unsettling stories help you relax or drift into sleep, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. New videos are here daily. Now, lower the volume, close your eyes, and let the night carry you into the story. I've been working as a park ranger for the National Park Service for 23 years now, patrolling trails and backcountry areas across various assignments in the western United States, maintaining wilderness areas and assisting visitors and enforcing regulations and conducting the routine work of preserving public lands. Spending weeks at remote ranger stations and months in seasonal postings and years accumulating the experience that eventually leads to senior positions with more responsibility and broader territory and the kind of autonomy that comes from proving yourself reliable across decades of service in challenging conditions. The Black Pine National Forest assignment came through last November, a winter posting to cover the northern districts while the regular rangers rotated to lower elevation stations or took accumulated leave during the season when visitor numbers dropped to near zero and most of the park became inaccessible due to snow and when the primary responsibilities shifted from public interaction to maintenance and wildlife monitoring and ensuring that the infrastructure survived the harsh mountain winter without damage that would require expensive repairs come spring. I arrived at the Black Pine headquarters on a gray afternoon in early December, reported to the district supervisor who provided the standard briefing about territory boundaries and communication protocols and emergency procedures, received keys to the patrol vehicle and the northern station cabin and the various gates and facilities I'd be responsible for monitoring during the winter months. The supervisor was a younger woman, maybe 15 years into her career, competent and professional in that way that suggested she'd learned the job thoroughly but hadn't yet accumulated the deeper knowledge that comes from decades of experience, from having seen enough unusual situations that you develop instincts about what matters and what doesn't, about when to follow regulations precisely and when experience suggests deviation from standard protocols. She spread a map across her desk showing the northern districts, traced the boundaries of my patrol area with her finger, indicated the main trails and access roads and notable features I should familiarize myself with, explained the winter closure procedures and the schedule for checking various facilities and the reporting requirements that would structure my work over the coming months. Standard information, standard procedures, nothing I hadn't encountered in previous winter postings, just the specific details of this particular territory and these particular responsibilities. But as I studied the map I noticed something odd, noticed a gap in the topographic representation, an area of perhaps 40 square miles that appeared blank, that showed no trails or features or elevation details, that seemed to exist as negative space within the otherwise comprehensive cartographic documentation of the district. I pointed this out to the supervisor, asked about this unmapped section, wondered whether it was simply an area awaiting survey or whether there was some administrative reason for the cartographic absence. She glanced at where I was pointing, seemed to hesitate for a moment, then said that area wasn't part of my patrol responsibility, that it was designated administrative land not open to public access, that I should focus on the mapped sections and shouldn't concern myself with areas outside my assigned territory. Her response felt rehearsed, felt like an answer she'd given before, felt like she was following a script rather than providing genuine explanation, but I didn't push the issue, just accepted her guidance and moved on to other topics, filed the observation away as a minor curiosity that probably had some boring bureaucratic explanation involving land ownership boundaries or jurisdictional complexity. I spent the first 2 weeks familiarizing myself with the mapped territory, driving the access roads, hiking the major trails, visiting the facilities and structures I'd be monitoring, learning the geography and the rhythms of this particular landscape during winter when snow transformed everything into variations of white and gray and the subtle browns of exposed bark on trees that had shed their needles or never had them. It was good country, was rugged mountain terrain with dramatic elevation changes and thick forest coverage and the kind of profound silence that comes from being truly remote, from being hours from the nearest town and miles from the nearest human presence besides myself. The northern station where I'd be living was a small cabin built in the 70s, updated periodically with better insulation and solar panels and modern communication equipment, positioned at a strategic location where several valleys converged and where a ranger presence provided coverage of a large territory from a single base. It was comfortable enough, had everything necessary for surviving a winter in isolation, had the worn-in quality of a place many rangers had occupied temporarily over the decades, each leaving small traces of their presence, modifications and improvements and the accumulated evidence of people passing through on their way to other assignments. The radio system was standard Park Service equipment, powerful enough to reach headquarters and other ranger stations across considerable distances, reliable in ways that older systems hadn't been, though still subject to the interference and dead zones that characterized mountain radio communication no matter how sophisticated the technology. I checked in twice daily as required, morning and evening, reporting conditions and activities and confirming operational status, maintaining the connection to the larger organizational structure even while operating in effective isolation for days at a time. It was during my third week, during an evening patrol along one of the northern boundary roads, that I first encountered the unmapped section by accident rather than through intentional exploration. I was following a maintenance road that supposedly terminated at an old fire lookout tower, was navigating through increasing snow depth as elevation gained, was focused on assessing whether this road would remain passable through the winter or whether it would need to be officially closed until spring. The road reached what the map indicated was the lookout tower location, but there was no tower, no foundation, no evidence that any structure had ever existed at this spot. I stopped the truck and studied the map more carefully, verified that I was definitely at the coordinates where the tower should be, checked my GPS against the cartographic representation, confirmed that according to all documentation I was in the right place but the documented feature simply didn't exist in physical reality. I got out of the truck and walked around the area looking for any remnants of the tower, any indication of what might have happened to it, any explanation for the discrepancy between map and terrain. The snow was relatively shallow here, maybe 8 inches, not enough to completely obscure a structure or foundation. But there was nothing, just forest and snow and the road ending at a point that apparently had no actual destination, had been built to reach something that either had never existed or had been so thoroughly removed that no trace remained. As I was searching the area I noticed what appeared to be a trail leading further north from this point, a clear path through the forest that showed no signs of recent use but that was definitely an intentional route rather than just a gap in the trees, that had the quality of established trails even though it appeared on none of my maps, even though according to all official documentation there should be no trail here. Nothing beyond this point except wilderness that wasn't part of the maintained trail system. I followed this trail on foot for about 15 minutes, walking through the quiet forest in the late afternoon dimness that comes early in December at this latitude, following a path that seemed well established despite having no official existence, that wound through the trees with the purposeful routing of a constructed trail rather than the random meandering of game paths. The trail eventually opened into a small clearing where I found evidence of human presence, found the remains of a campfire that wasn't recent but wasn't ancient either, found some weathered equipment that looked like Park Service gear, found indications that rangers or someone in official capacity had been in this location despite it being in the unmapped area, despite it supposedly being outside our patrol territories. I tried to radio headquarters to report what I'd found, tried to ask whether this was a decommissioned trail system or an old patrol route that had been abandoned, tried to get clarification about what I was looking at. But my radio wouldn't transmit, wouldn't connect to headquarters despite showing full power and proper function, would only produce static despite being in an area where signal should have been clear, where I should have had no difficulty reaching the main station. I returned to my truck and drove back toward the station, and as soon as I was away from that area my radio began functioning normally again, began picking up the usual background traffic and test signals, began working exactly as it should. I tried calling headquarters again once I had clear signal, tried to report what I'd found, tried to describe the unmapped trail and the evidence of previous ranger presence and the strange radio dead zone. The supervisor's response was strange, was carefully controlled in a way that suggested she was choosing words deliberately, was avoiding saying something directly while trying to communicate it indirectly. She said that areas outside the mapped sections weren't part of my assignment, that I should focus on documented trails and facilities, that there were old routes throughout the park that had been abandoned for various reasons and that stumbling across remnants of previous infrastructure wasn't unusual, that I shouldn't spend time investigating areas that weren't part of current operations. But something about her tone suggested more than just bureaucratic disinterest in abandoned trails, suggested actual concern about my having found this location, suggested warnings that she couldn't or wouldn't state explicitly. I acknowledged her guidance and signed off, but I found myself thinking about that clearing, about the evidence of ranger presence in an area that supposedly didn't exist on any official maps, about the radio dead zone that had prevented communication from that specific location. That night I went through the materials I'd been given when I arrived, searched through the documentation and maps and briefing materials looking for any mention of that area, any reference to trails or facilities that might correspond to what I'd found. Nothing. The documentation was comprehensive for the mapped sections but maintained complete silence about the area beyond the northern boundary road, the blank space on the maps, the unmapped section that apparently had no official existence despite clearly being part of the park's physical geography. I also searched through the filing cabinets at the station, looking through records left by previous rangers, hoping to find patrol logs or incident reports or any documentation that might mention that area. Most of the files were routine, were exactly what you'd expect from seasonal ranger assignments, just standard reports and maintenance records and the accumulated bureaucratic documentation of years of park operations. But I noticed something odd about the patrol logs, noticed gaps in the sequences, noticed that certain dates had no corresponding entries, noticed patterns suggesting that reports had been removed or that rangers had failed to file documentation for specific periods. The missing entries weren't random, weren't scattered across the years in ways that might suggest simple administrative oversight or lost paperwork. They clustered around certain dates, certain seasons, certain periods that aligned with winter assignments like mine, periods when rangers would be working alone in this northern district during the months when the park saw minimal visitation and when supervision was minimal and when rangers had maximum autonomy in how they conducted their patrols and what areas they chose to investigate. I spent several hours that night cross-referencing the gaps in the patrol logs with personnel records I could access through the Park Service database, trying to determine which rangers had been assigned to this station during the periods with missing documentation. The results were unsettling. Several of the rangers who'd worked this assignment during the winters when patrol logs went missing had no subsequent records in the system, had apparently left the Park Service immediately after their Black Pine winter posting, had disappeared from the organizational database as if they'd never continued their careers, as if their employment had ended or been terminated or been erased after they'd completed this particular assignment. I cross-referenced these names with broader searches, trying to find any information about where these rangers had gone after leaving Black Pine, whether they'd moved to other agencies or retired or left natural resource work entirely. But I found nothing, found no traces of these people beyond their initial assignments to Black Pine, found no indication of what had happened to them or where they'd gone, found only absence where there should have been career trajectories and subsequent positions and the normal documentation of people moving through the Park Service system over years and decades. It was possible this was just incomplete record keeping, was just the normal gaps and errors that accumulate in any large bureaucratic system, was just coincidental absence of information about people who'd happened to leave the agency in ways that weren't thoroughly documented. But combined with the unmapped section and the missing patrol logs and the supervisor's careful warnings about staying within assigned territory, it suggested something more deliberate, suggested active erasure rather than passive loss of records, suggested that rangers who'd investigated that unmapped area had somehow been removed from the official history of park operations. I tried to dismiss these thoughts as paranoid speculation, tried to tell myself I was reading too much into incomplete data and bureaucratic inefficiency and the normal strangeness that comes from working alone in remote locations where isolation and darkness and the absence of human contact can make ordinary things seem sinister. I went to bed telling myself I'd forget about the unmapped section, would focus on my assigned responsibilities, would avoid the kind of curiosity that had apparently gotten previous rangers into situations that ended their careers or their presence in official records. But I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about that trail and that clearing and that radio dead zone, couldn't stop wondering what was in that unmapped section that required it to be excluded from cartographic documentation, that prompted careful warnings from supervisors, that seemed to correlate with rangers disappearing from official records. I lay in the darkness of the cabin listening to winter wind and the settling sounds of the structure and the profound silence of mountain wilderness at night, and I thought about all the previous rangers who'd lain in this same bunk during previous winters, and I wondered how many of them had found that trail, had investigated that unmapped section, had encountered whatever it was that led to their erasure from Park Service history. The next morning I checked in with headquarters as required, gave my standard report on conditions and activities, made no mention of the unmapped section or my investigations into missing records. The supervisor acknowledged my transmission and signed off, and I went about my regular patrol duties, checking facilities and documenting wildlife observations and conducting the routine work of winter park operations. But by mid-afternoon I found myself driving back toward the northern boundary road, found myself unable to resist returning to that location, found that my curiosity had overwhelmed my caution and my intention to avoid areas outside my assigned territory. I told myself I was just going to verify what I'd seen, was just going to take some photographs and GPS coordinates, was just going to document the location properly before deciding whether to pursue further investigation. I reached the point where the maintenance road ended at the non-existent fire tower, parked the truck, and started following the unmarked trail on foot as I'd done the previous day. The trail was exactly as I remembered it, clear and well established despite appearing on no maps, winding through the forest with purposeful routing. I walked faster this time, moved with more confidence since I'd already traveled this path once, reached the clearing with the remnants of campfire and equipment in about the same time as before. But something was different, was wrong in ways that took me several minutes to identify. The equipment I'd seen yesterday was gone, was no longer scattered around the clearing, had disappeared despite this being a remote location where no one should be moving or removing materials. The campfire remains were also different, were less weathered than they'd appeared yesterday, looked more recent, looked like they might have been used within the past few weeks rather than months or years ago. I stood in the clearing trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the differences between yesterday's observations and today's reality, trying to determine whether I was misremembering or whether things had actually changed. I pulled out my phone to check the photographs I'd taken yesterday, planning to compare them against current conditions, but when I opened my photo app one found that yesterday's images weren't there, weren't in my phone's memory despite my clear recollection of taking multiple pictures of the trail and the clearing and the equipment I'd found. I checked my camera roll thoroughly, scrolled through all recent photos, verified that I hadn't accidentally deleted them or moved them to a different album. They simply didn't exist, had somehow been removed from my phone's storage, had vanished as completely as the equipment had vanished from the clearing. I tried to review my GPS history to verify that I'd been at these coordinates yesterday, tried to access the location data that my phone automatically recorded, but that data was also missing, showed no record of my having been in this area despite my certain knowledge that I'd spent over an hour here just 24 hours earlier. I pulled out my field notebook where I'd written descriptions of what I'd found, planning to review my notes from yesterday's patrol, but when I found the relevant pages they were blank, showed no entries for that date, showed no documentation of my having investigated this trail or found this clearing or observed any of the things I clearly remembered observing. The pages weren't torn out, weren't obviously altered, just blank as if I'd never written anything on them, as if yesterday's investigation had never occurred in any documented form. I stood holding my field notebook in the winter silence of that clearing, feeling a deep unease that went beyond normal confusion about missing documentation, feeling something fundamental shift in my understanding of what was happening here. This wasn't just incomplete record-keeping, wasn't just bureaucratic erasure of inconvenient information, was something more active and more thorough, was evidence that this unmapped section had properties that extended beyond simply being excluded from maps, had some quality that erased documentation of visits, that removed evidence of investigation, that prevented the creation of records that might acknowledge its existence. I tried using my radio to report what I was experiencing, tried to call headquarters and describe the missing photographs and GPS data and field notes, but as before my radio wouldn't function in this location, would only produce static despite showing full power and apparently operational status. I was being prevented from communicating about this place while I was in this place, was being isolated from any external contact that might document my presence here, was being subjected to the same erasure that had apparently affected previous rangers who'd investigated this unmapped section. I decided to leave immediately, to get back to my truck and return to areas where communication worked and where documentation persisted, to retreat from this location before whatever mechanism was removing evidence of visits did something more permanent than just deleting photographs and notes. I started back along the trail toward the maintenance road, walking quickly, almost running, feeling an urgency that came from understanding that I was in a place that didn't want to be known, that actively resisted documentation, that had properties I didn't understand and couldn't predict. But the trail was different, was longer than it had been on my way in, took me more than 30 minutes to traverse even though I was moving faster than before, seemed to stretch and extend as I walked as if the geography itself was changing, as if the distance between the clearing and my truck was increasing rather than remaining constant. I checked my compass, verified that I was heading in the correct direction, confirmed that I hadn't somehow gotten turned around or lost despite following an obvious trail through relatively open forest. When I finally reached the point where the trail should have met the maintenance road, I found that my truck wasn't there, found just forest and snow and no evidence of the road I'd driven in on, found myself standing in wilderness that looked nothing like the location where I'd parked less than an hour earlier. I spun around looking for landmarks, looking for anything I recognized, trying to orient myself in a landscape that had apparently changed while I was walking, that had transformed from familiar territory into something I didn't recognize despite having just traveled this exact route twice in the past 2 days. I pulled out my GPS unit, tried to determine my coordinates, tried to figure out where I was in relation to where I should be. But the GPS showed an error message, couldn't acquire satellite signal despite the clear sky and the open area and the normal conditions that should have allowed easy positioning. I tried my phone's GPS with the same result, couldn't get location data, couldn't determine where I was, couldn't access the technology I'd relied on for navigation throughout my ranger career. I stood there trying to control rising panic, trying to think rationally about my situation, trying to apply the wilderness survival training I'd received and the experience I'd accumulated over 23 years of backcountry work. I was lost in what should have been familiar territory, was disoriented in a landscape that had somehow changed from documented park infrastructure to unmapped wilderness, was experiencing something that didn't conform to normal expectations about how geography and navigation and documented reality function. I decided to walk in the direction I believed would lead back to the maintenance road, using sun position and terrain features to maintain orientation even without functioning GPS, relying on fundamental navigation techniques that didn't depend on technology. I walked for over an hour, covering what should have been more than enough distance to reach the road, covering terrain that grew less and less familiar, covering ground that seemed to be taking me deeper into unmapped territory rather than back toward documented areas. As afternoon began fading toward evening, I found myself in a small valley I'd never seen before, standing in landscape that didn't match any portion of the mapped sections I'd familiarized myself with during my first weeks at Blackpine, standing in geography that apparently existed somewhere within the park boundaries but that had no official existence, that was part of the blank space on the maps. That was within the unmapped section that I'd been warned not to investigate. In the valley bottom I found evidence of previous ranger presence, found what appeared to be an old ranger station that was smaller and more primitive than the cabin I'd been assigned, found a structure that looked decades old, that showed signs of having been occupied but abandoned, that stood as evidence that Park Service operations had once extended into this unmapped area before whatever policy or circumstance had led to its cartographic erasure. I approached the structure cautiously, noting that snow around it was undisturbed, that no tracks or recent signs suggested anyone had been here in months or years, that whatever this place was, it had been abandoned long enough for weather and time to begin reclaiming it. The door was unlocked, opened easily when I pushed it, revealed an interior that matched what I'd expected from an old ranger station, simple furniture and minimal equipment and the basic infrastructure needed for someone to live temporarily in an isolated location. But there were signs that the last occupant had left in a hurry or under unusual circumstances, had abandoned personal items and equipment and documentation that rangers would normally remove when closing a station. I found patrol logs and field notebooks scattered on a desk, found a radio system that was older than current equipment but that appeared functional, found supplies and personal effects that suggested someone had been living here and had left without properly securing or removing their belongings. I started reading through the patrol logs, found entries from a ranger named Mitchell describing investigations of this unmapped section, describing discoveries similar to what I'd been experiencing, describing how trails changed length and how documentation disappeared and how the geography seemed to resist being known or mapped or incorporated into official park records. The entries became increasingly concerned as they progressed, became increasingly focused on understanding what this place was and why it existed and what happened to rangers who investigated it too thoroughly. The final entries, dated from midwinter about 8 years ago, described Mitchell planning to radio headquarters with detailed reports about the unmapped section, planning to insist on proper investigation and documentation, planning to refuse to continue ignoring an area that was clearly part of the park but was being actively excluded from official recognition. The entries ended abruptly, stopped mid-sentence in a log entry that was never completed, stopped as if Mitchell had been interrupted while writing or had simply ceased to exist before finishing the documentation. I searched through other materials in the station, found more patrol logs from earlier years, found documentation from multiple rangers who'd apparently used this structure over decades, found accumulated evidence that this unmapped section had been known about and investigated and documented by various rangers over the years, but that all of this documentation had somehow failed to reach official records, had somehow been prevented from becoming part of the permanent archive of park operations. The radio in the station still had power, was apparently running on some kind of battery system that had maintained charge despite years of abandonment. I tried using it to call headquarters, tried to report my situation and request assistance, but received only static, received the same communication failure I'd experienced everywhere in this unmapped section, received confirmation that whatever prevented documentation also prevented real-time communication with areas outside this zone of cartographic absence. As darkness approached, I faced a decision about whether to spend the night in this abandoned station or attempt to continue navigating through unmapped territory in darkness. The rational choice was to shelter here, to wait for daylight before continuing efforts to find my way back to documented areas, to avoid the dangers of winter night travel through unknown terrain. But staying here meant spending night in a place that had apparently been occupied by rangers who'd subsequently disappeared from official records, meant remaining in the unmapped section for extended time, meant exposing myself to whatever properties this area had that led to erasure of people and documentation and evidence of investigation. I decided to stay, decided that nighttime navigation through unknown terrain was more immediately dangerous than whatever abstract threat this place represented, decided to use the shelter while it was available and resume my attempts to leave when morning provided better visibility and safer travel conditions. I secured the door, started a fire in the wood stove using fuel I found stacked against one wall, settled in to wait through the hours of darkness while wind picked up outside and snow began falling and the unmapped section disappeared into the absolute blackness of mountain wilderness at night. I spent that evening reading through all the documentation I could find in the station, reading through years of patrol logs from rangers whose names I didn't recognize, whose records apparently existed only here in this abandoned structure in an area that had no official existence. The logs described similar experiences across different time periods, described trails that changed length, described documentation that disappeared, described attempts to report findings that were never successfully communicated to headquarters, described gradual realization that this section of the park was being actively maintained as unmapped, as unknown, as existing outside the official geographic documentation of park boundaries and features. Several rangers had attempted to physically mark the boundaries of the unmapped section, had tried to establish clear delineations between documented territory and this area of cartographic absence. But their efforts had apparently failed, had resulted in markers disappearing or moving or being removed by some mechanism they couldn't identify, had demonstrated that the unmapped section resisted not just cartographic documentation but physical demarcation, resisted being defined or bounded or incorporated into the official geography of the park. One ranger, writing in logs dated about 15 years ago, had developed a theory that the unmapped section was deliberately maintained as a kind of buffer zone, was intentionally excluded from maps and records as a way of preventing something from being found or accessed or documented, was kept blank not because it was unknown but because it was too well known by someone who didn't want it officially acknowledged. This ranger had described finding evidence of much older human presence in the area, had found structures and artifacts that predated Park Service operations by decades or longer, had found indications that this area had been significant to earlier inhabitants in ways that modern park administration was working to conceal rather than preserve. These theories felt like paranoid speculation, felt like the kind of conclusions people reach when isolated and confused and trying to make sense of experiences that don't fit comfortable explanations. But they were theories developed by experienced rangers after extended investigation, were conclusions reached by multiple people over multiple years all encountering the same fundamental impossibilities about how this area functioned, were documented observations that all pointed toward deliberate maintenance of unmappedness rather than simple administrative oversight or incomplete cartography. I tried to sleep but found it difficult, found myself listening to the sounds of the structure settling and the wind outside and the fire crackling in the stove, found myself thinking about all the rangers who'd slept in this station before me, found myself wondering which of them had successfully left and which had become part of the erasure that seemed to affect people who investigated the unmapped section too thoroughly. I thought about Mitchell, whose final patrol log entry had ended mid-sentence, thought about the other names I'd found in documentation whose subsequent records were absent from Park Service databases, thought about becoming another name without subsequent records, another ranger whose career ended mysteriously after a winter assignment at Black Pine. Sometime deep in the night I was awakened by sounds outside the station, by what sounded like footsteps in snow, by evidence of movement around the structure despite this being a location that should be completely isolated from other human presence. I lay in the bunk listening, trying to determine whether the sounds were real or whether isolation and darkness and the strangeness of this situation were causing me to hear things that weren't actually there. The footsteps continued, circled the station, approached the door, then moved away, approached again, created patterns suggesting whoever was out there was examining the structure, was aware someone was inside, was interested in the station's current occupant. I got up quietly, moved to a window, looked out into the darkness illuminated only by starlight reflecting off snow. I saw a figure moving around the perimeter of the station, saw someone dressed in what appeared to be ranger uniform, saw what looked like another Park Service employee conducting some kind of inspection or patrol in the middle of a winter night in an area that officially didn't exist. I tried calling out, tried asking who was there and what they were doing, but received no response, received no acknowledgement that my voice had been heard despite the figure being close enough that sound should have carried easily through the winter silence. The figure continued its circuit of the station, appeared at different windows, seemed to be looking in though I couldn't make out facial features or identify who this might be. After perhaps 20 minutes of this the figure stopped at what I assumed was the front door, stood there motionless for several minutes, then turned and walked away into the darkness, disappeared into the forest surrounding the station, left me alone again with just wind and darkness and my inability to determine whether what I'd seen was real or some kind of projection or hallucination brought on by the strange properties of this unmapped section. I stayed awake the rest of the night, couldn't return to sleep after that encounter, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched or assessed or evaluated by something that lived in or monitored this unmapped area. Something that was aware of my presence here and was interested in determining whether I would become like the previous rangers whose documentation ended abruptly and whose subsequent records were absent from official databases. Dawn came slowly, came with gray light filtering through clouds and snow falling steadily, came with weather that would make navigation difficult but that at least provided enough visibility for me to attempt leaving this location and finding my way back to mapped territory. I gathered some of the documentation I'd found in the station, selected patrol logs and field notebooks that provided evidence of what had been happening in this area, planning to take them with me as proof of the unmapped section's existence and the rangers who'd investigated it, as documentation that couldn't be erased if I physically carried it out of this area. But when I picked up the materials I'd selected I found they were changing, found that text was fading from the pages as I held them, found that words were disappearing and leaving blank paper behind, found that the documentation was being erased in real time as I attempted to remove it from the station. Within minutes the logs and notebooks I'd selected had become completely blank, had been stripped of all text and data, had become meaningless blank books that provided no evidence of anything, that demonstrated the active mechanism by which this area resisted documentation and prevented evidence from being preserved or exported or incorporated into official records. I left the station and started walking, chose what I believed was southeast based on sun position barely visible through clouds, aimed for what should be the general direction of the maintenance road and mapped territory, hoped that sustained travel in a consistent direction would eventually lead me out of this unmapped section even if I couldn't determine my exact position or navigate using normal tools. The landscape I traveled through was beautiful in the way mountain wilderness is always beautiful in winter, was pristine snow and dark forest and dramatic topography, was scenery that under other circumstances would have been peaceful and restorative, would have been the kind of environment that had drawn me to ranger work in the first place. But knowing I was in an area that actively resisted being known, that erased evidence of visits, that had caused previous rangers to disappear from official records, transformed beauty into menace, transformed peaceful wilderness into threatening environment that I needed to escape before whatever mechanism operated here decided to erase me as it had apparently erased others. I walked for hours, covered what felt like considerable distance, passed through various types of terrain and elevation zones and forest compositions, saw no trails or markers or any evidence of human infrastructure, saw just wilderness that could have been anywhere in the mountain west, that gave no clues about where exactly I was or how to reach mapped territory. My radio remained non-functional, my GPS continued showing error messages, my phone had no signal, all my technological tools were rendered useless by whatever properties this unmapped section possessed. Around midday I found myself back at the abandoned ranger station I'd left hours earlier, found that I'd somehow traveled in a circle despite my efforts to maintain consistent direction, found that the unmapped section had redirected my travel back to where I'd started despite my attempts to leave. I stood looking at the station in frustration and growing fear, understanding that I was trapped here, that the area wasn't allowing me to leave, that whatever mechanism kept this section unmapped was also keeping me contained within it, was preventing my return to documented territory. I tried again, chose a different direction, walked with even more careful attention to maintaining course, used multiple reference points to verify I wasn't circling back, traveled through the afternoon with determination to escape this area before another night arrived. But by evening I found myself once again approaching the station, once again discovering that regardless of my efforts I was being directed back to this location, once again confronting evidence that the unmapped section controlled travel within its boundaries, that it could redirect or simply prevent movement in directions it didn't permit. This time I noticed something I'd missed before, noticed that my footprints from earlier travels were absent from the snow around the station, noticed that despite having passed through this area multiple times I was leaving no lasting evidence of my presence, noticed that the snow showed no tracks or traces of my movements, showed no documentation of my having been here even though I was physically present and physically interacting with the environment. I was being erased, was being removed from physical documentation just as previous rangers had been removed from bureaucratic documentation, was becoming an absence rather than a presence, was ceasing to leave evidence of my existence in ways that matched how the area left no evidence of its own existence on official maps. I understood then what had happened to the rangers whose records ended abruptly, understood that they hadn't left or retired or moved to other positions, understood that they'd been absorbed by the unmapped section, had been incorporated into its geography, had become part of the area's properties rather than remaining separate individuals who could document and report and communicate about what they'd found. I was becoming unmapped like the territory I'd investigated, was becoming blank space in the Park Service records, was becoming absence rather than presence, was ceasing to exist in any documented form even as I continued to physically exist in this winter landscape that had no official recognition, that maintained its secrecy through active erasure of anyone who investigated too thoroughly, who penetrated too deeply into the question of why this section existed outside cartographic documentation. That night I didn't try to sleep, didn't see the point of resting when I understood that time was actively working against me, that each hour I remained in the unmapped section brought me closer to complete erasure, to becoming like Mitchell whose final log entry ended mid-sentence, to becoming another gap in the patrol records, another ranger whose subsequent career history was absent from databases because there was no subsequent career to document. I sat in the abandoned station reading through more of the accumulated documentation by firelight, reading through decades of observations from rangers who'd encountered the same impossibilities I was experiencing, who documented the undocumentable until the mechanism of erasure caught up with them, who'd left these records in a station where they were safe from external erasure but where they were also trapped, where they existed only within the unmapped section rather than becoming part of official archives. One ranger had written extensively about theories of why the unmapped section existed, had speculated that it served as a kind of geographic buffer between different types of reality, between documented consensus reality and something else that couldn't be acknowledged within normal frameworks of understanding how landscape and geography and space functioned. This ranger had theorized that the unmapped section was necessary, was deliberately maintained by something larger than park administration, was kept blank as a way of preventing documented reality from having to incorporate or acknowledge or deal with what existed in this area. These theories felt simultaneously insane and perfectly reasonable, felt like the kind of speculation that emerged when intelligent people encountered fundamental impossibilities and tried to construct explanations within the only frameworks available to them, tried to make sense of experiences that defied sensible explanation. I found myself developing similar theories, found myself wondering whether the unmapped section existed between mapped areas the way dark matter exists between visible matter, providing structure and connection while remaining invisible and unacknowledged, serving functions that were necessary but that couldn't be incorporated into official understanding of how the park system operated. Another night passed with sounds of movement outside, with footsteps circling the station, with the sense of being observed by something that existed in or monitored this unmapped territory, something that was aware of rangers who entered this area and that evaluated them according to criteria I didn't understand, that made decisions about whether they could leave or whether they would be absorbed into the geography of unmappedness, whether they would return to documented reality or become part of the blank space on the maps. By the third morning I had accepted that I wasn't going to leave through normal navigation, wasn't going to walk out of this area by simply choosing the right direction and maintaining course, wasn't going to escape through conventional means because the unmapped section didn't operate according to conventional geographic rules. I needed to understand what this place wanted, needed to determine what criteria governed who could leave and who became permanently absorbed into the undocumented wilderness. I spent that day exploring the area around the station more systematically, not trying to leave but trying to understand, trying to map the unmapped section in my mind if not on paper, trying to learn its boundaries and features and properties through direct observation since technological tools were useless here and written documentation disappeared as soon as I tried to create it. I found other structures scattered through the unmapped section, found remnants of old survey camps and primitive shelters and the weathered remains of equipment that predated modern park service operations by decades, found evidence that this area had been known and investigated and occupied long before current policies of cartographic erasure had been implemented. I found carved markers on trees that showed dates from the early 20th century, found survey stakes with numbers that didn't correspond to any coordinate system I recognized, found indications that whatever had been here had attracted attention from earlier generations of land managers and wilderness administrators who'd apparently conducted operations in this area before it became officially unmapped. In one location I found what appeared to be a memorial cairn, found stones stacked in ways that suggested deliberate construction, found a weathered metal plaque embedded in the rocks that bore names of people I didn't recognize and a date from 1934 and text that read, "Lost to the wilderness, may they find what they sought." I stood looking at this memorial trying to understand whether it referred to people who died here or people who'd been erased here, whether it commemorated actual deaths or the kind of administrative disappearance that removed people from official records while their physical fates remained unknown. As I explored I began to notice patterns in how the landscape responded to my presence, began to understand that the unmapped section wasn't just passively existing outside cartographic documentation but was actively maintaining that state, was deliberately resisting being known or mapped or incorporated into official geography. The trails that changed length, the documentation that disappeared, the footprints that vanished from snow, the way attempted departures curved back to the station, all of these were mechanisms by which the area preserved its unmappedness, by which it prevented documentation and prevented knowledge from being exported to the external world. But I also noticed that the area wasn't completely successful in this resistance, noticed that the abandoned ranger station still existed despite containing documentation of the unmapped section, noticed that the memorial cairn still stood despite bearing names and dates that acknowledged something had happened here. The unmapped section could erase active attempts at documentation, could remove evidence that was being created in real time, but apparently couldn't or didn't erase evidence that had existed long enough to become part of the landscape itself, that had weathered enough seasons to become features rather than just temporary human intrusions. This suggested a strategy for survival, suggested that if I could persist long enough, could remain present without being erased until my presence became naturalized, became part of the unmapped section's landscape rather than an intrusion into it, I might be able to retain my existence even if that existence remained undocumented in official records. I might become like the abandoned station or the memorial cairn, might persist as physical reality even while being absent from maps and databases, might continue existing while being officially erased. But this would mean accepting permanent residence in the unmapped section, would mean giving up any hope of returning to mapped territory and documented life, would mean becoming like Mitchell and the other rangers whose records ended abruptly, whose subsequent careers didn't exist because they never left this area, never returned to the external world where their activities could be tracked and documented and incorporated into official histories. I spent another night in the station considering this possibility, considering whether survival as an undocumented presence in unmapped territory was preferable to complete erasure, whether existing outside official reality was better than not existing at all. I read through more of the accumulated documentation, found evidence that some rangers had apparently made this choice, had apparently accepted residence in the unmapped section and had continued living here conducting patrols and maintaining facilities and performing ranger duties in an area that had no official existence, serving as guardians of a geography that didn't appear on any maps. I found logs describing a community of sorts, describing multiple rangers living in the unmapped section simultaneously, coordinating patrols and sharing resources and maintaining the infrastructure of wilderness management in an area that received no official support or recognition, that existed outside the normal chain of command and budget allocations and administrative oversight that governed park operations everywhere else. These logs described a kind of shadow ranger service operating within the unmapped section, described people who'd been erased from official records but who continued their work anyway, who maintained their dedication to wilderness preservation even after being absorbed into the very wilderness they were meant to preserve. The most recent of these logs, dated from just a few years ago, suggested that this shadow ranger presence was ongoing, that somewhere in the unmapped section there might still be rangers conducting patrols and maintaining stations and performing the duties they'd been trained for despite having been erased from official existence. I wondered if the figure I'd seen circling the station at night was one of these erased rangers, wondered if I was being evaluated by someone who'd already made the choice I was now facing, who'd already accepted permanent residence in unmapped territory and who was now assessing whether I would make the same choice or whether I would simply disappear completely, would be erased so thoroughly that even physical presence in this area wouldn't persist. On the fourth morning I made my decision, made it not through conscious deliberation but through simple acceptance of what had become obvious, made it through understanding that I wasn't going to leave, that the unmapped section had absorbed me as it had absorbed others, that my ranger career from this point forward would be conducted in territory that officially didn't exist, in service to wilderness that appeared on no maps, in dedication to preservation that would never be documented or acknowledged or incorporated into the official history of Park Service operations. I began treating the abandoned station as my station, began organizing it for occupation rather than just temporary shelter, began conducting patrols through the unmapped section as if it were my assigned territory, began performing the duties I'd been trained for even though those duties would never be reported or logged or recognized by any supervisor or administrator in the documented world beyond the boundaries of this cartographic absence. I found that once I'd made this acceptance, once I'd stopped trying to leave or document or communicate with external authorities, the unmapped section became more stable, became more knowable, revealed geography that had been hidden or unstable while I'd been trying to map it or escape it. I could navigate reliably within the area, could find my way between various features and structures, could patrol the territory with the competence I'd developed over 23 years of ranger work, even though this territory would never appear on any official maps. I encountered other rangers, encountered the figures I'd seen at night, encountered people who'd been erased from official records but who continued their work in the unmapped section, who welcomed me into their community of undocumented wilderness guardians, who taught me the particular skills and knowledge required to function in an area that actively resisted being known or documented or incorporated into consensus reality. They explained that the unmapped section served a necessary function, served as a boundary between documented wilderness and something else, something older and stranger that couldn't be acknowledged within modern frameworks of park management, something that required this buffer zone of cartographic absence to prevent it from bleeding into the mapped areas, from affecting the documented portions of the park in ways that would force uncomfortable acknowledgments of realities that park administration preferred to keep officially unrecognized. They explained that rangers who investigated the unmapped section too thoroughly, who penetrated too deeply into understanding what it was and why it existed, faced a choice between accepting erasure and becoming part of the area's guard force, or resisting erasure and simply ceasing to exist even in the undocumented physical reality of the unmapped section itself. They explained that I'd already made the right choice by accepting presence over documentation, by choosing to continue ranger work even in the absence of official recognition, by valuing the actual preservation of wilderness over the bureaucratic acknowledgement of that preservation. I joined their patrols, learned the boundaries of the unmapped section, learned what features required monitoring and what areas needed protection, and what the actual purpose of this undocumented wilderness was beyond simply serving as blank space on official maps. I learned that the area had been known to indigenous peoples long before Park Service operations, had been maintained as a kind of sacred buffer by people who understood that some places needed to exist outside normal geography, needed to remain unmapped not because they were unknown but because they were too well known, because their true nature couldn't be reconciled with the assumptions about reality that governed documented civilization. I learned that the Park Service had inherited this responsibility, had taken over maintenance of the unmapped section from earlier custodians, had implemented policies of cartographic erasure not out of bureaucratic incompetence or administrative oversight but out of genuine necessity, out of understanding that some places had to remain officially non-existent to prevent what they contained or protected or buffered from becoming officially acknowledged, from forcing confrontations with realities that modern administrative frameworks couldn't accommodate. And I learned that the rangers who served in the unmapped section, who accepted erasure from official records to continue protecting this undocumented wilderness, were performing perhaps the most important work in the entire park system, were maintaining boundaries that prevented documented reality from having to incorporate or acknowledge or deal with what existed beyond those boundaries, were serving as guardians of a geography that existed between mapped consensus reality and whatever lay beyond the boundaries of what could be officially recognized. I spent what I estimated was several weeks learning the rhythms and requirements of patrol work in the unmapped section, learning how to navigate without GPS, how to document observations without written records that would disappear, how to maintain awareness and knowledge through memory and direct experience rather than through external recording systems. I learned the locations of the various structures scattered through the area, learned which ones were still occupied by other erased rangers and which had been abandoned by guardians who completed their service and moved on to whatever fate awaited those who finished their duty in unmapped territory. I learned that time functioned differently here, that seasons and days didn't align precisely with the calendar that governed the mapped world, that the unmapped section existed in a slightly different temporal relationship to external reality, that what felt like weeks here might be months in documented time, that my assignment to Black Pine Northern District might already have ended in official records, might already have resulted in another ranger being assigned to my territory, might already have generated questions about what happened to me that would be answered with the same administrative vagueness that had answered questions about Mitchell and all the other rangers whose records ended abruptly after investigating this area. I wondered if my wife had been notified, if she'd been told I'd disappeared or died or simply been informed that my employment had ended, if she was searching for me or mourning me or had simply accepted bureaucratic explanations about my sudden absence from our life together. I wondered if there would be investigations or memorial services or any official acknowledgement of my disappearance, or whether I would simply become another gap in the personnel records, another ranger whose career history had an inexplicable ending, another name that might be noticed by some future investigator who'd wonder what happened to the person who'd worked at Black Pine for one winter and then vanished from all subsequent documentation. But these wonderings became less urgent as I settled into the rhythms of unmapped patrol duty, became less important as I adapted to existence outside documented reality, became peripheral concerns compared to the actual work of maintaining this buffer zone, of protecting the boundaries between mapped wilderness and whatever lay beyond them, of serving as guardian of geography that officially didn't exist but that served functions more vital than most of the documented territories I'd patrolled. During my 23 years of official ranger service, I encountered the things the unmapped section was buffering against, encountered the reasons why this area needed to remain outside cartographic documentation, encountered realities that confirmed the necessity of maintaining blank spaces on official maps, of preserving zones where ordinary rules of geography and time and physical consistency didn't fully apply, where the world operated according to older principles than those that govern documented civilization. I saw landscapes that shifted and changed without physical causation, saw terrain that responded to observation by becoming different than it had been before being observed, saw geography that existed in multiple states simultaneously until someone looked at it and collapsed those possibilities into a single documented configuration. I saw time flowing in directions other than forward, saw events occurring in sequences that violated normal causality, saw effects preceding causes and futures influencing pasts in ways that made linear temporal progression seem like a parochial assumption rather than a universal constant. I saw things that couldn't be described without the descriptions themselves becoming part of what was being described, saw phenomena that existed in a gap between observation and documentation, saw realities that required unmappedness to persist, that would collapse or transform or escape if they were ever incorporated into official cartography, into documented geography, into the consensus reality of mapped wilderness. And I understood why rangers who encountered these things had to be erased from official records, had to become undocumented themselves, had to accept unmappedness as the price of knowledge about what unmapped sections contained and protected and buffered against. Because anyone who truly understood what existed in these areas couldn't be allowed to return to documented reality with that knowledge, couldn't be permitted to describe or report or testify to what they'd seen, couldn't remain part of the official Park Service while knowing that official maps were deliberately incomplete, were deliberately excluding areas whose existence would challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of wilderness and geography and reality itself. The choice I'd made, the acceptance of erasure in exchange for continued ranger service, had been the only choice that allowed me to persist at all, had been the only alternative to complete disappearance, had been the path that let me continue being what I'd always been, a ranger dedicated to wilderness preservation, even if that dedication now operated outside official recognition, outside documented history, outside the mapped reality where my career had begun and where most rangers completed their entire service without ever encountering the unmapped sections that existed as necessary blanks in the cartographic documentation of public lands. I settled into long-term residence at the station that had belonged to Mitchell and probably to many rangers before him, settled into conducting patrols through territory that appeared on no maps, settled into protecting wilderness that officially didn't exist, settled into service that would never be acknowledged or commemorated or incorporated into official Park Service history. I maintained the facilities, conducted wildlife observations, monitored the boundaries between mapped and unmapped territory, performed all the duties I'd been trained for across 23 years of documented ranger work, plus the additional duties that came from working in an area where normal rules of reality were deliberately suspended, where consensus geography gave way to older and stranger principles of how landscape and space and time could be organized. I occasionally encountered the boundaries of the unmapped section, found the edges where documented territory began and unmapped wilderness ended, found the transition zones where official cartography resumed and where geography stabilized into the consistent configurations that characterized mapped areas. I could see into documented territory from these boundaries, could see rangers conducting normal patrols through official wilderness, could observe the park operations continuing as they always had, could watch the system I'd been part of for over 2 decades functioning exactly as it was supposed to function in areas that hadn't absorbed me into unmappedness. But I couldn't cross back into that documented world, couldn't return to mapped territory, found that the boundaries were permeable in only one direction, allowed entry into unmapped wilderness but prevented exit, maintained the one-way flow that had brought me here and that had brought Mitchell and all the other erased rangers whose names appeared in the accumulated documentation at the station, whose service continued in unmapped sections while their official careers ended in gaps and absences and missing records that would never be adequately explained to anyone who noticed them. I thought about all the blank spaces on maps, thought about all the gaps in official cartography across all the parks and forests and wilderness areas administered by the Park Service, thought about how many of those blanks might be deliberately maintained zones like this one, might be areas where erased rangers continued their service outside documented reality, might be buffer zones protecting consensus geography from having to acknowledge or incorporate or deal with what existed beyond the boundaries of official recognition. I thought about the thousands of rangers who disappeared from official records over the decades of Park Service operations, thought about how many had simply left the service versus how many had been absorbed into unmapped sections, had become guardians of undocumented wilderness, had accepted erasure in exchange for continued service in areas that couldn't be officially acknowledged. I thought about whether this was a common fate or a rare one, whether unmapped sections were exceptional anomalies or whether they were standard features of wilderness management, whether the blank spaces on maps were primarily unexplored areas or primarily areas that couldn't be documented without forcing acknowledgments about reality that park administration preferred to avoid. And I thought about the visitors who occasionally penetrated into unmapped sections by accident, who wandered off official trails and crossed into undocumented territory, who encountered the same impossibilities and challenges and choices that rangers encountered when investigating these areas. I wondered how many simply disappeared completely, how many were erased so thoroughly that even their memories in other people's minds were affected, were removed from the documented world so completely that it was as if they'd never existed at all. And I wondered how many made the same choice I'd made, accepted unmappedness in exchange for survival, became permanent residents of areas outside official geography, lived out their remaining years in wilderness that appeared on no maps and that would never acknowledge their presence or record their lives or incorporate their existence into any official documentation. The winter progressed in the unmapped section according to rhythms that didn't quite align with calendar measurements, progressed through cycles of weather and darkness and the particular challenges of mountain wilderness in deep cold, progressed toward spring, though I had no way to know whether that spring would arrive on schedule or whether time in this area would continue its slightly displaced relationship to external calendar, whether the seasons here would align with seasons in mapped territory or would maintain their own independent progression. I continued my patrols, continued maintaining the station, continued performing ranger duties in undocumented wilderness, continued existing as an erased presence in unmapped geography, continued serving as guardian of boundaries that protected documented reality from having to acknowledge what existed beyond the edges of official cartography. I accepted that this was my life now, accepted that my career would continue in unmapped sections, accepted that I would never return to documented existence, never rejoin the official park service, never see my wife again, never exist in any records or databases or official acknowledgments of ranger service. I accepted unmappedness as the price of knowledge, accepted erasure as the cost of understanding, accepted absence from official reality as the consequence of penetrating too deeply into the question of why certain areas appeared as blanks on maps, why certain territories existed outside cartographic documentation, why the Park Service maintained zones that officially didn't exist but that required constant patrol and protection and service from rangers who'd been absorbed into the same undocumented status as the wilderness they protected. And I understood finally what all those missing patrol logs had documented before being removed, understood what Mitchell and the others had learned before their records ended, understood what every ranger who'd investigated unmapped sections eventually discovered, that wilderness was more complicated than maps suggested, that geography was stranger than cartography acknowledged, that reality was less documented and less knowable and less stable than the official frameworks implied, that some places had to remain blank not because they were unknown but because knowing them required accepting unmappedness yourself, required becoming part of the absence you were investigating, required erasure from official existence as the price of understanding why certain sections of wilderness appeared as empty spaces on maps that claimed comprehensive documentation of public lands. I was unmapped now, was blank space, was absence rather than presence, was erased from records while continuing to exist in territory that had no official recognition, was serving as ranger in wilderness that appeared on no maps, was protecting boundaries between documented reality and something older and stranger that required buffer zones of cartographic absence to prevent it from affecting the consensus geography that governed the mapped world where most people lived their entire lives. Without ever encountering the unmapped sections that existed as necessary blanks in the official documentation of wilderness. This was ranger work too, was perhaps the most important ranger work, was service that would never be acknowledged or commemorated or incorporated into official histories but that maintained fundamental boundaries, that protected essential distinctions, that preserved the separation between documented civilization and what existed beyond the edges of maps, beyond the limits of cartography, beyond the boundaries of what could be officially recognized without forcing acknowledgments that would challenge the fundamental assumptions about reality that governed the mapped world and everyone who lived their lives entirely within documented geography. I was erased but I was still a ranger, was absent from records but still present in wilderness, was unmapped but still serving, still protecting, still maintaining the boundaries between different types of reality, still performing the duties I dedicated 23 years of documented service to and would dedicate however many years of undocumented service remained to me in this unmapped section where I would continue my patrols and maintain my station and guard the boundaries that appeared as blank spaces on official maps, as gaps in official documentation, as absences that were actually presences, as unmappedness that was the most important mapping of all, the acknowledgement through deliberate exclusion that some places existed outside the frameworks that governed documented geography, existed as necessary blanks that protected mapped reality from having to incorporate or acknowledge or deal with what lived in the spaces between official cartography, in the gaps between documented wilderness, in the unmapped sections that appeared as absences but that rangers like me knew were presences, were territories requiring service, were wilderness demanding protection even from being known, from being mapped, from being incorporated into the official geography of public lands that claimed comprehensive documentation while deliberately maintaining blanks, maintaining gaps, maintaining unmapped sections where erased rangers continued their service outside all official recognition, outside all documented reality, outside the mapped world but still within wilderness, still within duty, still within the calling that had drawn us to ranger work in the first place and that continued to direct our service even after we'd been absorbed into the unmappedness we'd been sent to investigate, even after we'd become blank spaces ourselves. Even after we'd been erased from official records but had chosen to persist anyway in unmapped territory where geography was strange. And time was flexible and reality operated according to older principles than those that governed the documented world beyond the boundaries we now patrolled and protected and preserved through service that would never be acknowledged, never be commemorated, never be incorporated into the official history of ranger operations, but that was ranger work nonetheless. Was wilderness protection nonetheless, was essential service nonetheless, even in its unmappedness, even in its erasure, even in its existence outside all official documentation of who we were and what we did and where we served in the blank spaces on the maps.
I've been working as a digital archivist for the Municipal Records Department for 16 years now, cataloging and preserving documentation from various city agencies and departments, processing the endless flow of paperwork and digital files that accumulate in any large urban bureaucracy, maintaining the systems that allow government operations to reference their own histories, ensuring that records required by law or regulation or simple administrative necessity remain accessible and properly organized despite the constant pressures of budget constraints and technological change and the general entropy that affects all information storage systems over time. It's tedious work in ways that most people would find unbearable, work that requires comfort with extreme detail and repetitive processes and the kind of sustained attention to categorization and metadata that seems to cause physical pain in people who aren't naturally inclined toward archival thinking. Most of my colleagues left within their first few years, transferred to other departments or left city employment entirely, unable to tolerate the combination of monotony and precision that characterizes proper archival practice, unable to maintain the discipline required to process thousands of documents according to exacting standards, while maintaining awareness that any error in classification or storage could render crucial records permanently inaccessible. But I've always found satisfaction in this work, always appreciated the way proper archival practice creates order from chaos, always enjoyed the challenge of designing classification systems and metadata schemas that could accommodate the bewildering variety of documentation that flows through municipal operations, always felt that maintaining institutional memory was fundamentally important work, even if it received little recognition or appreciation from people who'd never needed to locate a crucial document from decades past and had never understood how much effort went into ensuring that document remained findable and accessible despite time and technological change. The Records Department occupied 3 floors of an aging municipal building in the downtown administrative district, housed in spaces that had been inadequate for our purposes since before I started working here, spaces that had grown progressively more cramped as physical archives accumulated and as digital storage systems proliferated, and as the sheer volume of documentation requiring preservation exceeded our capacity to properly organize and maintain it. We'd been promised new facilities for years, had been assured that funding would eventually materialize for proper archival storage and modern climate control and the infrastructure necessary for long-term preservation of both physical and digital materials, but those promises never translated into actual construction or actual improvement of our working conditions. I'd recently been assigned responsibility for processing a large backlog of security camera footage from various municipal facilities, footage that was supposed to be reviewed and cataloged and stored according to retention schedules that specified how long different types of recordings needed to be preserved before they could be legally destroyed. This was exactly the kind of tedious project that drove other archivists to resignation, required watching hours of footage showing nothing but empty hallways and parking lots and building exteriors, required documenting the mundane reality of municipal facilities during periods when absolutely nothing of interest occurred, required maintaining focus and attention while processing material that was monumentally boring. The footage came from cameras installed at dozens of city-owned buildings, came from schools and libraries and administrative offices and maintenance facilities and parks buildings and community centers, came in various formats depending on what equipment had been installed at each location, came with varying levels of documentation about when it was recorded and what location it represented and whether anything notable had occurred during the recording period. My job was to standardize all this disparate material, convert it to consistent formats, catalog it properly, verify it against incident reports to identify any recordings that documented events requiring extended retention, and arrange for proper storage or destruction according to the applicable schedules. I'd been processing this backlog for about 3 months, had reviewed thousands of hours of footage, had cataloged hundreds of recordings from dozens of locations, had settled into the rhythm of this work in the way you settle into any repetitive task, had developed efficient procedures for quickly assessing footage and determining its proper classification and retention requirements. Most recordings required only minimal review, just enough to verify they matched their documentation and contained no incidents requiring special attention, just enough to confirm they showed what they were supposed to show and could be processed according to standard schedules. The recording that changed everything came from a security camera at the West Side Public Library, a branch facility in a working-class neighborhood, not a location that typically generated notable security incidents or required extended retention of surveillance footage. The recording was dated from 14 months prior, was labeled as overnight coverage from a camera monitoring the library's main reading room, was part of a batch that should have been processed and destroyed months ago, but had somehow been overlooked in the backlog that preceded my assignment to this project. I queued up the footage planning to give it the standard quick review before cataloging it for destruction, planning to verify it showed the expected empty reading room during closed hours, planning to spend maybe 2 minutes confirming it contained nothing requiring special retention before moving on to the next recording in the endless queue. The footage began as expected, showed the reading room from a ceiling-mounted camera position, showed empty tables and chairs and bookshelves in the dimmed lighting that characterized library facilities during closed hours, showed exactly what overnight security footage from a library should show. I was about to skip ahead through the recording, planning to sample a few points throughout its duration to verify consistency before approving it for destruction, when I noticed movement in the frame. This wasn't unusual. Security cameras often captured maintenance staff or security guards during overnight hours, often showed people moving through supposedly closed facilities for legitimate reasons. But something about this movement seemed wrong, seemed inconsistent with how people normally appeared in security footage, seemed to violate basic expectations about how human figures should look when captured by fixed cameras in known lighting conditions. The figure moved across the reading room in ways that didn't match normal human locomotion, moved with a fluidity that seemed wrong, moved in directions that suggested either the camera angle was extremely distorted or the figure wasn't subject to normal gravitational constraints. I rewound the footage and watched again, paying closer attention, trying to determine whether I was seeing camera malfunction or lens distortion or actual anomalous movement. The figure appeared again, entered from the right side of the frame, moved across the reading room in that same unsettling way, passed behind bookshelves that should have obscured it but somehow remained visible as if the shelves weren't there or as if the figure existed in some relationship to space that made physical objects irrelevant to its visibility. I paused the footage at a point where the figure should have been clearly visible in the center of the frame, should have been easily identifiable as staff or security or intruder, should have resolved into recognizable human form. But the paused image showed something that didn't resolve into anything recognizable, showed a form that was clearly present in the frame but that somehow resisted visual interpretation, that appeared different each time I looked at it, that seemed to change configuration while remaining static in the paused image, that hurt to look at in ways that suggested my visual processing was struggling to accommodate what the camera had recorded, was failing to construct a stable interpretation of the recorded data. I started the footage again, watched the figure continue its movement across the reading room, watched it interact with the space in ways that made no sense, Watched it pass through areas where it should have triggered lighting sensors or displaced air or left some evidence of physical presence, but that showed no such effects, showed only the figure's passage through space that seemed not to register its presence except visually, seemed not to respond to it as it would respond to an actual physical entity moving through the environment. The figure exited the frame after approximately 40 seconds of visible movement, disappeared from the camera's view in the same impossible way it had appeared, left the reading room empty again, showing no evidence that anything had been present, showing no disturbance of furniture or books or any physical trace that something had moved through the space. I continued watching the footage for another 10 minutes, watched the empty reading room showing nothing unusual, watched completely mundane overnight security footage that gave no indication anything anomalous had occurred. I rewound to the section showing the figure, watched it again, confirmed that I was actually seeing what I thought I was seeing, confirmed that this wasn't fatigue or distraction or misperception, but was actual recorded footage showing something that moved and appeared in ways that violated basic assumptions about how physical entities behaved when captured by security cameras. I exported that section of the footage, saved it separately from the full recording, created a backup copy on my personal drive, documented the timestamp and camera location and the nature of what the footage appeared to show. Then I sat at my workstation trying to decide what to do with this information, trying to determine whether this was something I should report to supervisors or whether bringing attention to anomalous footage would create problems for me, would make me seem unreliable or prone to seeing things that weren't there, would damage my professional reputation in ways that might affect my career in the risk-averse environment of municipal employment where drawing attention to yourself was generally disadvantageous regardless of the reason. I decided to investigate further before reporting anything, decided to review other footage from the same camera to see whether this was an isolated incident or a recurring phenomenon, decided to check footage from other cameras at the Westside Library to see whether similar anomalies appeared in multiple recordings, decided to gather more evidence before making any claims about security cameras recording things that shouldn't exist according to normal understanding of physical reality and how surveillance equipment functioned. I pulled all available footage from the Westside Library, pulled recordings from the 6 months before and after the incident I'd observed, pulled footage from all 5 cameras that monitored different areas of the facility, started a systematic review looking for any other anomalies or unusual activity or evidence that what I'd seen wasn't unique to that one recording from that one camera on that one night. This meant hours of additional work beyond my normal responsibilities, meant staying late and coming in early and dedicating time that should have been allocated to processing the backlog toward investigating something that might turn out to be nothing, that might be camera malfunction or corrupted data, or some mundane technical issue that just appeared anomalous due to my limited understanding of how security equipment operated. But I found more incidents, found additional footage showing similar figures moving through the library during closed hours, found recordings from multiple cameras showing entities that appeared and moved and interacted with space in the same impossible ways I'd observed in the first recording. The figures appeared sporadically, appeared on average once every few weeks in the available footage, appeared in different areas of the library and at different times of night, appeared without pattern or predictability or any obvious connection to external events or circumstances. Most incidents followed the same basic pattern. Figure appears, moves through space in ways that violate normal physics, exits frame or disappears, leaves no physical evidence of presence. The figures varied in apparent size and shape, varied in the specific ways they violated normal movement and spatial relationships, varied in duration of visibility from 20 seconds to over 3 minutes. But all shared the fundamental quality of being clearly recorded by security cameras while being fundamentally incompatible with normal expectations about how physical entities behaved when captured by surveillance equipment. I expanded my investigation, started reviewing footage from other municipal facilities, started looking for similar anomalies in recordings from libraries and schools and administrative buildings across the city. This required accessing footage that wasn't technically part of my assigned backlog, required using archival access privileges in ways that might be questioned if anyone noticed, required gradually consuming all my available time both during work hours and increasingly during evenings and weekends as the investigation expanded beyond what I could accomplish during normal working hours. And I found more incidents, found similar figures appearing in footage from multiple facilities across the city, found evidence that whatever these entities were, they weren't confined to a single location, weren't specific to the West Side Library, weren't isolated anomalies, but were recurring phenomena documented by security cameras throughout the municipal surveillance infrastructure. The frequency varied by location. Some facilities showed incidents monthly, while others showed only 1 or 2 occurrences across years of available footage, but the pattern was consistent. Security cameras were recording things that moved and appeared and interacted with space in ways that shouldn't be possible, were documenting entities that violated basic physical principles while being captured with the same fidelity and technical quality as normal recorded footage. I began cataloging these incidents systematically, created a database documenting every anomalous recording I found, noted the timestamp and location and camera and duration and specific characteristics of each figure's appearance and behavior. I developed classification systems to categorize different types of anomalies, developed methodologies for measuring the degree to which observed phenomena deviated from normal expectations, developed analytical frameworks for studying patterns in when and where these entities appeared and what behaviors they exhibited during their brief periods of visibility. This work consumed me in ways that normal archival processing never had, activated something in my personality that thrived on investigation and pattern recognition and the challenge of making sense of data that resisted conventional interpretation. I stopped processing the assigned backlog entirely, redirected all my time and attention toward documenting and analyzing the anomalous footage, toward building a comprehensive catalog of security camera recordings that showed things that shouldn't exist according to consensus reality, but that definitely existed according to properly functioning surveillance equipment deployed throughout the city. After 2 months of investigation, I documented over 300 incidents, had cataloged anomalous recordings from 47 different municipal facilities, had accumulated evidence that suggested these entities appeared regularly throughout the city, appeared in public buildings during periods when those buildings were supposedly empty and closed, appeared to security cameras while apparently remaining invisible to any human observers who might have been present, appeared in ways that were consistent enough to constitute a genuine phenomenon while remaining varied enough to resist simple explanation or reduction to any single cause or mechanism. I tried to find references to these entities in other sources, tried to determine whether anyone else had noticed them or documented them or reported them to authorities or academic institutions or any organization that might be studying anomalous phenomena captured by surveillance equipment. But I found nothing, found no previous documentation of figures that appeared in security footage while violating basic physical principles, found no reports of similar observations from other municipalities or security professionals or researchers studying surveillance technology, found no acknowledgement anywhere that security cameras were routinely recording things that shouldn't exist. This absence of external documentation was itself strange, suggested either that I was the first person to notice these entities despite decades of security camera deployment across countless facilities, or that other people who'd noticed had remained silent about their observations, or that some mechanism was preventing this information from being shared or acknowledged or incorporated into official knowledge about what security cameras captured during their normal operations. I started looking for institutional responses to these recordings, started checking whether any of the anomalous footage I'd found had generated incident reports or investigations or any administrative action beyond routine archival processing. I searched through maintenance records and security logs and incident documentation, searching for any evidence that the entities captured in these recordings had been noticed by the people responsible for monitoring security camera feeds or responding to unusual activity in municipal facilities. I found occasional references, found incident reports filed by security guards describing unusual sensor activations or the feeling of presence in supposedly empty buildings, found maintenance logs noting equipment malfunctions that coincided with times when anomalous figures appeared in footage, found scattered documentation suggesting that people working in these facilities had sensed something unusual even if they hadn't directly observed the entities that security cameras were recording. But I also found evidence of suppression, found incident reports that had been filed and then deleted, found security logs that had been edited to remove references to unusual occurrences, found documentation that showed an active process of removing evidence that might suggest anything anomalous was happening in municipal facilities. The suppression wasn't perfect, wasn't thorough enough to eliminate all traces, but it was systematic enough to suggest deliberate policy rather than random administrative cleanup, suggested someone was actively monitoring for reports of unusual phenomena and was removing those reports from official records before they could generate broader attention or investigation. I cross-referenced the deletion patterns with personnel records, trying to determine who had access and authority to remove incident reports and security logs, trying to identify who might be implementing this suppression. The trail led to a small unit within the Department of Public Safety, a unit with vague mandate language about anomalous incident response and special security protocols. A unit that appeared to have been created specifically to handle reports of unusual phenomena in municipal facilities, a unit that operated with minimal oversight and that had authority to access and modify records across multiple departments. I requested documentation about this unit through normal archival channels, submitted standard requests for organizational charts and budget documents and mission statements, and any other materials that might explain what this unit actually did and why it had authority to delete incident reports and modify security logs. My requests were denied, were rejected with vague explanations about security classification and confidentiality requirements, were deflected in ways that suggested this unit's operations were deliberately obscured even from internal municipal oversight, even from archival documentation that was supposed to preserve comprehensive records of governmental operations. I tried informal approaches, tried asking colleagues whether they knew anything about this unit, tried gathering information through casual conversation and professional networking rather than through formal records requests that had been rejected. But no one I talked to had any knowledge of this unit, had never heard of it despite it being referenced in various systems I had access to, despite it clearly existing as an operational entity with budget allocations and personnel assignments and specific responsibilities within the municipal bureaucracy. This combination of official existence and practical invisibility was itself anomalous, suggested the unit was deliberately maintained in a state where it could function with authority while remaining unknown to most city employees, where it could access and modify records while avoiding the scrutiny that normally accompanied governmental operations, where it could respond to reports of unusual phenomena while ensuring those reports never became part of official knowledge that might require broader acknowledgement or institutional response. I decided to document my findings in a comprehensive report, decided to compile all the anomalous footage I'd found along with analysis of patterns and frequencies and the evidence of systematic suppression, decided to create a permanent record that would preserve this information even if my investigation was shut down or my employment was terminated or I was otherwise prevented from continuing this work. I spent 2 weeks preparing this documentation, organized it according to archival standards that would make it accessible and comprehensible to any future researcher who might discover it, included all the metadata and classification information necessary for the material to be properly understood and evaluated. I stored copies of this documentation in multiple locations within the archival systems, stored it using classification codes that would make it difficult to find through normal search processes, but that would preserve it indefinitely according to retention schedules, stored it in ways that would resist deletion even if someone discovered its existence and wanted to remove it from official records. I was creating a hidden archive within the official archives, was using my knowledge of record systems to ensure this information would persist even if actively suppressed, was ensuring that evidence of security cameras recording things that shouldn't exist would remain accessible to anyone who knew where to look and how to search for it. The day after I completed this documentation process, I received a message requesting my presence at a meeting with representatives from the Department of Public Safety, A meeting scheduled for the following morning. A meeting whose stated purpose was vague, but whose timing suggested someone had noticed my investigation and had decided to intervene before it progressed further. I spent that evening considering my options, considering whether to attend this meeting or whether to take sick leave and avoid whatever confrontation was being arranged, considering whether my investigation had placed me in professional jeopardy or whether this meeting would be routine discussion that happened to coincide with my research timing. I decided to attend, decided to see what these representatives wanted to discuss, decided to defend my investigation if necessary by arguing that documenting unusual phenomena in security footage was within my responsibilities as an archivist processing surveillance recordings. I arrived at the designated conference room 15 minutes early, found it empty, waited alone thinking about what I would say if questioned about my research, how I would justify the time spent investigating anomalous footage instead of processing the assigned backlog. 2 people arrived exactly at the scheduled meeting time, introduced themselves as working for the anomalous incident response unit I'd been researching, confirmed they knew about my investigation, confirmed they'd been monitoring my access to security footage and my documentation of unusual recordings, confirmed that my activities had generated sufficient concern to warrant this direct intervention. They were professional and calm, showed no hostility or aggression, spoke in measured tones that suggested this was routine procedure for them, that they regularly conducted these kinds of interventions with city employees who'd noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. They explained that the entities appearing in security footage were known to their unit, were documented phenomena that had been under observation for several years, were the subject of ongoing study and management that required confidentiality to prevent public panic or institutional disruption. They explained that my investigation had been thorough and competent, had discovered patterns and frequencies that aligned with their own research, had demonstrated analytical capabilities that were valuable for understanding these phenomena. They offered me a position with their unit, offered to transfer me from the records department to work specifically on analyzing and cataloging anomalous security footage, offered to make my investigation official rather than having to shut it down and suppress the documentation I'd created. The position would involve higher classification level, would require security clearances and confidentiality agreements, would prevent me from sharing my findings with colleagues or family or anyone outside the unit, would effectively isolate me from normal municipal operations and integrate me into whatever secret structure existed for managing phenomena that security cameras recorded but that weren't supposed to exist. I asked what these entities actually were, asked for explanation beyond vague references to documented phenomena and ongoing study, asked for the information that would allow me to make an informed decision about whether to accept their offer. They said they couldn't provide detailed briefings until I'd been formally transferred and had completed the required security clearance process. Said some information could only be shared with people who'd committed to participating in the unit's work. Said I'd have to accept the position before learning what I'd actually be working on. This requirement felt deliberately structured to prevent informed consent, felt designed to trap people who discovered these entities into working for the unit before they understood what they were committing to, felt like a mechanism for ensuring that anyone who noticed the anomalous footage would either join the suppression apparatus or would be isolated and discredited and prevented from sharing their observations. But I also recognized I had limited options, recognized that refusing would likely result in my investigation being shut down and my employment being terminated or my credibility being destroyed in ways that would make it impossible for me to continue researching these phenomena. I asked for time to consider their offer, asked for a week to review my options and decide whether to accept the transfer or remain in my current position. They agreed, said they'd wait for my decision, said they hoped I'd choose to join their work because people with my analytical capabilities were rare and valuable for understanding the entities that appeared in security footage. They left after providing contact information, left me alone in the conference room to process what had just occurred, to consider what accepting their offer would mean for my career and my investigation and my ability to continue studying phenomena that security cameras recorded but that weren't supposed to exist according to consensus reality. I spent that week reviewing all the anomalous footage I'd collected, reviewing the patterns I documented, reviewing my analysis of where and when these entities appeared and what behaviors they exhibited during their brief periods of visibility to security cameras. I tried to determine what I actually knew versus what I was speculating about, tried to separate observed phenomena from theoretical interpretation, tried to assess whether joining the unit would give me better access to understanding these entities or whether it would trap me in a suppression apparatus that would prevent genuine investigation. The footage showed entities that moved through space in ways that violated physics, that appeared and disappeared without physical causation, that interacted with environments in ways that suggested they existed in different relationships to space and time than normal physical objects, that were captured by cameras with perfect fidelity despite apparently being invisible to human observers and despite leaving no physical evidence of their presence beyond what was recorded by surveillance. Equipment. These observations suggested several possible interpretations. The entities might be genuine physical phenomena that existed in ways human perception couldn't detect but that camera sensors could capture, might be artifacts of how security cameras processed and recorded visual data that created apparent entities from technical glitches or sensor errors, might be evidence of realities or dimensions or states of existence that overlapped with normal space in ways that made them occasionally visible to surveillance equipment while remaining hidden from direct human observation. Without more information, I couldn't determine which interpretation was correct, couldn't distinguish between mundane technical explanation and genuinely anomalous phenomena, couldn't resolve the fundamental question of whether security cameras were recording things that actually existed in some sense or whether they were generating apparent entities through technical processes that created illusions of presence where nothing was actually present. Joining the unit would potentially give me access to more data, to more expertise, to resources and information that could help resolve these questions. But it would also bind me to confidentiality requirements that would prevent me from sharing findings, would integrate me into an institutional structure that had demonstrated commitment to suppressing public knowledge of these entities, would potentially compromise my ability to conduct independent investigation or reach conclusions that contradicted official interpretations. I decided to accept their offer, decided that access to more information was worth the constraints they would impose, decided that understanding these phenomena was important enough to justify joining an organization that might ultimately be working to obscure rather than illuminate what security cameras were recording. I contacted the unit representatives and informed them of my decision, began the process of security clearance and formal transfer, began transitioning from my role as general archivist to specialized position analyzing anomalous surveillance footage. The clearance process took 3 months, involved extensive background investigations and psychological evaluations and interviews designed to assess my reliability and discretion and commitment to maintaining confidentiality about classified information. I continued my normal archival work during this period, continued processing the backlog of security footage while knowing that my investigation of anomalous recordings had been noticed and had generated response from the unit that managed such phenomena, while waiting to learn what I'd actually committed to by accepting their offer. The transfer was finalized in March, 17 years after I'd started working for the Municipal Records Department. After spending nearly 2 decades building expertise in archival practice and records management, and the systems that preserved institutional memory across municipal operations, I was assigned to a small office in a different building, was introduced to the 3 other analysts who worked for the Anomalous Incident Response Unit, was given access to databases and documentation and analytical tools that had been developed specifically for studying entities that appeared in security camera footage. The briefing materials explained what the unit had learned through years of investigation, explained the current state of knowledge about these entities and the theories that had been developed to account for their appearance in surveillance recordings. The entities were called remnants in the unit's internal documentation, were theorized to be residual traces of events or presences that had occurred in the locations where they appeared, were understood as something like recordings that had been captured not by cameras but by space itself. by the physical environment that somehow preserved impressions of significant occurrences and occasionally replayed those impressions in ways that security cameras could detect and record. This theory explains several observed patterns. Why remnants appeared more frequently in locations where significant events had occurred, why they showed repetitive behaviors that suggested replay of recorded actions rather than conscious activity, why they didn't interact with current physical environment except in limited ways that suggested they existed in different temporal relationship to the space they appeared in. The theory suggested remnants weren't entities in the sense of having consciousness or agency, but were more like visual echoes, were impressions left in space that occasionally became visible through mechanisms the unit didn't fully understand, but that seemed to involve security cameras acting as detection equipment for phenomena that existed outside normal sensory perception. But this was just one theory, was the interpretation that currently had most support within the unit but wasn't definitively proven, wasn't accepted as final explanation but rather as working hypothesis that guided ongoing investigation and analysis. Other theories were still considered possible. Remnants might be glimpses of parallel timelines or alternate realities that occasionally intersected with our own in ways that made them briefly visible to surveillance equipment, might be actual entities from other dimensions or states of existence that occasionally manifested in our space, might be genuinely anomalous phenomena that couldn't be explained within current scientific frameworks and required entirely new theoretical approaches. My work would involve analyzing new remnant appearances as they were detected, would involve looking for patterns that might support or contradict existing theories, would involve developing better classification systems and analytical methodologies for studying phenomena that resisted conventional investigation, would involve contributing to the unit's ongoing effort to understand what security cameras were recording when they captured entities that shouldn't exist according to normal. Understanding of physical reality. The unit maintained surveillance over security camera systems throughout the city, maintained automated detection systems that flagged potential remnant appearances for human review, maintained databases documenting thousands of incidents going back over a decade, maintained research programs studying correlations between remnant appearances and various factors like location history and electromagnetic conditions and temporal patterns, and dozens of other variables that might influence when and where these entities became visible to surveillance equipment. I was given access to all this accumulated data, was given the documentation of a decade of investigation that I could review and analyze and use as foundation for my own research. I spent weeks immersed in this material, studying the patterns other analysts had found, studying the theories that had been developed and tested and refined, studying the comprehensive documentation of phenomena that I'd only begun to investigate during my months of independent research before joining the unit. The data confirmed several things I'd observed during my preliminary investigation. Remnants appeared throughout the city without obvious geographic pattern, appeared at all times during overnight hours when facilities were closed and cameras were monitoring empty spaces, appeared with frequencies that varied by location but averaged approximately one appearance per facility per month across the entire municipal surveillance infrastructure. The data also revealed patterns I hadn't noticed. Remnants were more likely to appear during specific times of year, showed subtle correlations with lunar phases and electromagnetic weather conditions, exhibited behaviors that sometimes matched documented historical events that had occurred in the locations where they appeared. This last pattern was particularly significant, suggested the theory about remnants being spatial recordings might be correct, might explain why these entities appeared in specific locations and sometimes exhibited behaviors that corresponded to events that had occurred in those spaces sometimes decades earlier. The unit had documented cases where remnants appeared to be replaying murders and accidents and other significant occurrences, had found historical records that matched the actions and movements visible in surveillance footage, had built increasingly strong evidence that what cameras were recording were genuinely echoes of past events rather than current entities or technical artifacts. But not all remnants matched this pattern. Not all could be correlated with documented historical events. Not all exhibited behaviors that suggested replay of past occurrences. Some appeared to be doing things that had no obvious connection to location history. Some moved through spaces in ways that suggested purpose or intention rather than mechanical replay. Some interacted with current physical environment in ways that couldn't be explained if they were just recordings playing back in space that had captured them. These anomalous cases suggested the spatial recording theory wasn't complete, wasn't sufficient to explain all observed phenomena, needed refinement or supplementation with additional theoretical frameworks. I focused my initial work on these anomalous cases, on remnants that didn't fit the dominant theory, on entities that exhibited behaviors or characteristics that suggested they might be something other than replayed recordings. I built databases categorizing different types of anomalous behavior, developed classification systems that could capture the variations in how different remnants interacted with space and time and physical environment, developed analytical frameworks for studying what differentiated anomalous cases from standard replay-type appearances. After 6 months of this work, I'd identified a subset of remnants that showed consistent patterns of anomalous behavior that appeared to demonstrate awareness of their environment, that interacted with current physical space in ways that suggested they existed in present time rather than being replays from the past, that exhibited what could only be described as purposeful movement and apparently intentional actions. These entities appeared less frequently than standard remnants, appeared only in approximately 5% of documented cases, but they appeared consistently enough across different locations and times to constitute a genuine category rather than just random variation in remnant behavior. I designated these cases as active remnants to distinguish them from the passive replay-type appearances that constituted the majority of documented incidents, began building comprehensive documentation of every active remnant case I could find in the unit's archives, began studying them specifically to determine whether they represented fundamentally different phenomena or whether they were just more complex versions of the same spatial recording mechanism that explains standard remnant appearances. The evidence increasingly suggested they were different, suggested active remnants weren't recordings but were actual entities that existed in some relationship to our space while remaining invisible to normal perception, that were captured by security cameras because surveillance equipment detected wavelengths or phenomena that human vision couldn't process, that moved through municipal facilities conducting activities whose purpose I couldn't determine but that appeared deliberate and organized rather than random or mechanically repetitive. I presented my findings to the unit leadership, presented the evidence that some remnants exhibited behaviors inconsistent with the spatial recording theory, presented the case for recognizing active remnants as a distinct category requiring different theoretical approach and potentially different management protocols. The response was mixed. Some analysts agreed my analysis was sound and supported establishing the new category. Others argued I was overinterpreting normal variation in remnant behavior. Others suggested I was seeing patterns that reflected my expectations rather than genuine phenomena. But the unit director was interested, was intrigued by the possibility that some of what cameras were recording might be actual entities rather than just replayed impressions, was willing to support further investigation of active remnants to determine whether they represented genuinely different phenomena. I was given resources and authority to conduct targeted research, was given access to real-time monitoring of locations where active remnants had appeared previously, was given capability to deploy additional cameras and sensors at sites where I predicted these entities might appear based on patterns I'd identified. I spent the next year conducting this research, studying active remnants specifically, developing better detection and documentation methods, gradually building evidence that these entities weren't recordings but were something that existed currently, that moved through the city conducting activities I still didn't understand but that appeared purposeful and consistent, that interacted with physical environment in subtle ways that suggested they were aware of and responding to current conditions rather than mechanically replaying past events. The more I studied these entities, the more convinced I became that they were genuinely anomalous, were things that existed outside normal physical frameworks, were presences in the city that remained invisible to human perception but that security cameras could detect and record, that moved through municipal facilities during overnight hours when those buildings were empty, and when their activities wouldn't be interrupted by human presence, that were doing something in these spaces, though I couldn't determine what their activities accomplished or what purpose they served. I tried various experimental approaches to understanding these entities, tried deploying different types of sensors and recording equipment to detect them through methods beyond visual surveillance, tried analyzing environmental conditions when they appeared to identify physical changes that might indicate their presence, tried everything I could think of to gather more data about what these entities actually were and what they were doing in the locations where security cameras captured them. The results were inconclusive. Different experimental approaches yielded conflicting data. Different theoretical frameworks suggested different interpretations. Different analytical methods produced different conclusions about what active remnants represented and how they existed in relationship to our physical reality. I accumulated vast amounts of data without achieving definitive understanding, documented hundreds of active remnant appearances without resolving the fundamental questions about what these entities were or what they were doing or why security cameras could record them while they remained invisible to normal perception. After 2 years of specialized research, I'd made progress in documentation and classification but hadn't achieved breakthrough in understanding, hadn't developed theories that could explain active remnants with the same confidence that the spatial recording theory explained standard remnant appearances, hadn't reached conclusions that satisfied the scientific standards that should govern research into anomalous phenomena even when those phenomena defied conventional scientific frameworks. I began to suspect that understanding active remnants might require different methodologies than those the unit employed, might require approaches that weren't based on treating them as objects of study but rather as entities with which some form of communication or interaction might be possible. This was speculative and potentially dangerous, suggested attempting contact with entities whose nature I didn't understand and whose responses to such contact I couldn't predict, suggested moving beyond passive observation toward active engagement that could produce outcomes ranging from breakthrough understanding to complete disaster. I proposed this approach to the unit director, proposed attempting communication with active remnants as a research methodology, proposed developing protocols for interaction rather than just continuing passive documentation and analysis. The response was immediate rejection, was adamant refusal to authorize any attempt at contact with these entities, was clear statement that the unit's role was observation and documentation rather than engagement or interaction, was warning that suggesting such approaches demonstrated concerning judgment that made my continued work with the unit questionable. I was placed on administrative leave pending review of my research methods and my adherence to approved protocols, was subjected to additional psychological evaluation to determine whether my work with anomalous phenomena had affected my judgment or mental stability, was investigated to verify I hadn't already attempted unauthorized contact with active remnants during my research activities. The investigation found no evidence of protocol violations. The psychological evaluation found no indicators of compromised judgment or stability, but the unit director remained concerned about my proposed research direction and skeptical about whether I should continue working on active remnant analysis. I was reassigned to different projects within the unit, was moved away from active remnant research toward more routine analysis of standard remnant appearances, was effectively demoted from specialized research position back to basic analytical work that didn't involve the controversial theoretical approaches I'd been developing. I accepted this reassignment without protest, understood that challenging it would likely result in my complete removal from the unit, understood that maintaining access to the surveillance data was more important than maintaining prestigious research assignments, understood that I could continue investigating active remnants independently even if I wasn't officially authorized to do so. I continued my routine analytical work during normal hours while conducting unauthorized research during evenings and weekends, continued documenting active remnant appearances through the monitoring systems I still had access to, continued developing theoretical frameworks and experimental approaches even though I couldn't implement those approaches without violating the protocols I'd been warned to follow. I maintained 2 parallel research programs, one official and approved and thoroughly documented in ways that demonstrated my compliance with unit policies, one hidden and unauthorized and carefully concealed from supervisors who were now watching my work more closely following my proposed contact experiments. The hidden research revealed patterns I hadn't noticed during my official investigation, revealed that active remnants appeared to be coordinating their activities across multiple locations, appeared to be part of organized operations rather than isolated individual entities, appeared to be conducting systematic activities throughout the municipal infrastructure in ways that suggested purpose and planning and collective rather than individual agency. I documented cases where multiple active remnants appeared simultaneously at different facilities, where their movements suggested coordination or communication, where their activities seemed to build on or respond to what other entities were doing at other locations. This coordination suggested active remnants might be parts of a larger system or organization, might be individual components of some collective that existed in the city conducting operations that remained invisible to human observation, but that were extensively documented by security cameras that detected and recorded these entities even though the people monitoring those cameras either didn't notice or were instructed not to acknowledge what was being captured. The implications were disturbing, suggested the city contained a parallel presence that operated in the same spaces humans occupied but remained imperceptible except through technological mediation, suggested something was using municipal facilities for purposes that the actual human inhabitants and administrators of those facilities remained unaware of. I tried to identify patterns in where and when active remnants appeared most frequently, tried to determine whether their activities concentrated in particular types of facilities or particular areas of the city, tried to map their movements and coordination to understand what they might be accomplishing through their organized presence in spaces they appeared to treat as territory or infrastructure or resources for purposes I couldn't determine from passive observation alone. The mapping revealed disturbing patterns, revealed that active remnant activity was highest in infrastructure facilities, in water treatment plants and electrical substations and communication hubs, and the other systems that supported municipal operations, revealed these entities were focusing their attention on the functional infrastructure of the city rather than on the public spaces or residential areas or commercial facilities where human activity concentrated. This suggested they were interested in systems rather than people, were engaging with the technological and infrastructural networks that made urban life possible rather than with the humans who lived within those networks, were conducting activities related to the functioning of municipal infrastructure in ways that might mean they were monitoring those systems or maintaining them or interfering with them or using them for purposes that had nothing to do with their intended functions as human-built infrastructure. I couldn't determine which of these possibilities was correct from the available evidence, couldn't distinguish between benign monitoring and active interference through passive observation of entities moving through facilities and occasionally interacting with equipment in ways that security cameras captured but that didn't leave lasting physical evidence or measurable effects on system operations. I needed more direct data, needed information beyond what surveillance footage could provide, needed to implement the contact experiments I'd been forbidden from attempting through official channels. I began planning unauthorized contact attempts, began developing protocols for interaction that might allow communication with active remnants without creating obvious evidence that would alert unit supervisors to my activities, began identifying locations where I could attempt contact without being observed by other personnel or caught by the monitoring systems the unit used to ensure analysts followed approved protocols. This required careful preparation, required understanding the unit's surveillance of its own researchers, required developing methods for evading detection while conducting experiments that would constitute serious violations of the restrictions that had been imposed on my research. I selected a municipal water treatment facility that showed high levels of active remnant activity, selected overnight hours when the facility would have minimal staff and when my presence could be explained as routine security inspection if questioned, selected a location where I had legitimate reasons to be even though my actual purposes were unauthorized and potentially dangerous. I brought specialized equipment that I'd assembled from components that wouldn't individually suggest contact experiments, brought recording devices and electromagnetic sensors and communication equipment that I hoped might allow interaction with entities that security cameras could detect but that remained invisible to normal perception. I positioned myself in the control room where active remnants had appeared most frequently in the surveillance footage, positioned my equipment to detect and potentially communicate with these entities if they appeared during my observation period, waited through the first hours of my overnight vigil seeing nothing unusual, seeing just the normal operation of a water treatment facility during periods of minimal staffing and automated control. Around 3 in the morning, during the dead hours when active remnants appeared most frequently according to my analysis of the historical data, I began detecting electromagnetic signatures that didn't correspond to the facility's normal equipment, began measuring energy patterns that suggested something was present in the control room even though I couldn't see anything and even though the room appeared empty except for myself and the equipment I'd brought. I activated the communication protocols I'd developed, broadcast signals on frequencies that my theoretical work suggested might be detectable by entities that existed in different relationships to physical reality than normal matter, attempted to establish contact using methods that were based on speculation and incomplete theory rather than on proven techniques or established protocols. I didn't expect immediate results, didn't expect these entities to respond to first contact attempts from a single researcher conducting unauthorized experiments in the middle of the night, didn't expect breakthrough communication from one session of poorly designed experimental procedures. But the electromagnetic signatures changed in response to my broadcasts, changed in ways that suggested reaction to my communication attempts, changed in patterns that appeared deliberate rather than random or mechanically responsive to stimulus, changed in ways that looked like attempts at communication rather than just ambient electromagnetic noise reacting to the signals I was transmitting. I adjusted my protocols based on these responses, attempted to establish consistent patterns of signal and response, attempted to develop a basic communication framework through iterative refinement of what signals generated what responses from the electromagnetic signatures that appeared to represent active remnant presence in the facility. After several hours of this experimental interaction, I'd established what appeared to be rudimentary communication, had developed signal patterns that generated consistent responses, had created something that resembled exchange of information even though I couldn't yet determine what information was being conveyed or what the entities were trying to communicate through their electromagnetic responses to my signals. But this was more progress than years of passive observation had achieved, was evidence that active remnants could interact with human researchers if approached through appropriate methodologies, was confirmation that my theoretical work about these entities being accessible to communication rather than just observation had been correct, even though implementing that theory had required violating unit protocols. I documented this session carefully, recorded all the electromagnetic data and the communication attempts and the response patterns, created comprehensive documentation of the experimental procedures and results that would allow replication or refinement of the contact protocols I'd developed. I stored this documentation separately from the unit systems, stored it in personal archives where it couldn't be discovered through the monitoring that supervised official research activities, stored it as evidence that active remnants were communicable entities rather than just observable phenomena, that the unit's passive approach was unnecessarily limiting our understanding of what these entities were and what they were doing in the city. I conducted additional contact sessions over the following months, gradually refined my communication protocols, gradually developed more sophisticated methods for interacting with active remnants and interpreting the electromagnetic responses that appeared to constitute their side of our exchanges. The communication remained limited, remained frustratingly basic compared to what I hoped to achieve, remained more like sensing presence and basic acknowledgement than like actual conversation or substantive information exchange. But it was progress, was development of capability that the unit had declared impossible or inadvisable, was foundation for potentially breakthrough understanding if I could develop these methods further. During one session approximately 6 months after my initial contact experiments, I received what appeared to be a direct communication from an active remnant, received electromagnetic patterns that resolved into something resembling structured information rather than just reactive responses to my signals, received what might have been an attempt to convey meaning rather than just acknowledge my presence and my communication attempts. I recorded these patterns carefully, analyzed them extensively after the session ended, attempted to interpret what information the entity might have been trying to convey through the electromagnetic signals it had generated. The analysis was difficult, required making assumptions about how these entities encoded information and what concepts they might be trying to communicate and what framework of shared understanding might exist between human researcher and active remnant that would allow meaningful exchange of information. But working through these interpretative challenges, I developed a tentative translation of what the entity had communicated, developed an understanding that suggested it was trying to explain what active remnants were and what they were doing in the city and why security cameras could detect them while they remained invisible to human perception. According to this interpretation, active remnants were maintenance entities, were things that existed to preserve and repair and optimize the systems that supported human civilization, were presences that operated continuously in the infrastructure spaces of cities conducting work that kept those systems functioning properly even though the humans who built and nominally maintained those systems remained unaware of this parallel maintenance effort. They existed in different relationship to matter and energy than humans did, existed in states that made them imperceptible to biological senses but detectable by technological sensors like security cameras, existed throughout urban infrastructure conducting necessary work that human maintenance couldn't accomplish or didn't recognize as necessary. This explanation aligned with several patterns I'd observed. The concentration of active remnant activity in infrastructure facilities, their interaction with equipment and systems, their coordinated operations across multiple locations, their apparent lack of interest in humans except as obstacles to avoid or factors to account for in their maintenance activities. If this interpretation was correct, then active remnants weren't anomalous entities that needed to be contained or studied or managed, but were beneficial presences that were actively contributing to municipal operations, were things that should be recognized and potentially cooperated with rather than just observed and documented without acknowledgement. But I had no way to verify this interpretation, had no way to confirm that my translation of electromagnetic signals was accurate rather than being projection of my own expectations onto ambiguous data, had no way to prove that active remnants were maintenance entities rather than something else entirely that just happened to concentrate in infrastructure facilities for reasons I didn't understand. I needed more communication, needed more data, needed to develop better protocols for exchanging information with these entities so that I could verify my interpretations and develop accurate understanding of what they were and what they were doing. I continued my unauthorized contact experiments, continued refining communication protocols, continued attempting to extract clearer information from active remnants about their nature and purpose and relationship to human infrastructure. But the communication remained difficult, remained limited by fundamental differences in how humans and these entities processed and conveyed information, remained frustratingly ambiguous even as I developed more sophisticated experimental methods and analytical frameworks for interpreting the electromagnetic exchanges that constituted our interaction. During one session about 8 months into my contact research, I received a communication that appeared to be a warning, received electromagnetic patterns that suggested the active remnants were concerned about something, were trying to alert me to some problem or danger or situation that required attention. I couldn't interpret the specific content of the warning, couldn't determine what they were concerned about or what they were trying to alert me to, could only sense that the communication carried urgency and importance beyond the routine exchanges that had characterized most of our previous interactions. I increased the frequency of my contact sessions, attempted to gather more information about what the warning referred to, attempted to communicate my willingness to receive more detailed information if the entities could convey it through our limited communication protocols. The responses I received suggested increasing urgency, suggested whatever they were warning about was approaching or intensifying, suggested time was limited for whatever response they were trying to prompt from me through our electromagnetic exchanges. I began monitoring surveillance footage more intensely, looking for changes in active remnant behavior that might indicate what they were concerned about, looking for patterns that might explain the warning they were attempting to convey. I noticed increasing coordination in their activities, noticed more entities appearing simultaneously across different facilities, noticed their movements becoming more purposeful and directed, noticed what appeared to be preparation for something, mobilization towards some goal or response to some situation that I couldn't identify from the available data. And I began noticing changes in the standard remnants as well, began observing that the passive replay type entities were appearing more frequently, were showing up in locations where they rarely appeared historically, were exhibiting behaviors that suggested the spatial recording mechanism was becoming more active or more visible or was being affected by whatever was causing the active remnants to mobilize. The standard remnants had always been relatively stable phenomena, had appeared with consistent frequencies and in predictable patterns that the unit had documented extensively over years of observation. But now those patterns were changing, those frequencies were increasing, those behaviors were showing variations that suggested something fundamental was shifting in whatever mechanisms made these entities visible to security cameras. I reported these changes through official channels, documented the increasing remnant activity in my routine analytical work, attempted to alert unit leadership to patterns that suggested significant developments were occurring in the phenomena we were supposed to be monitoring and understanding. But my reports were dismissed, were treated as overinterpretation of normal variation, were rejected as evidence that my previous unauthorized research had compromised my judgment and made me prone to seeing patterns that didn't actually exist in the data. I tried to explain that these weren't normal variations, tried to present the statistical evidence showing that current remnant behavior was significantly different from established baselines, tried to demonstrate that something genuine was changing in ways that the unit needed to recognize and respond to. But my credibility within the unit had been damaged by my contact experiments and my continued advocacy for approaches that leadership had rejected, had been compromised by my insistence on interpreting active remnants as communicable entities rather than just observable phenomena, had been undermined by my history of pushing boundaries that the unit had established as limits on acceptable research. So my warnings were ignored, my documentation was filed away without serious consideration, my attempts to alert the unit to significant changes in remnant behavior were treated as further evidence of poor judgment rather than as valuable observations that should inform unit operations and research priorities. I found myself isolated within the organization, found my analyses dismissed regardless of their merit, found that my position within the unit had become marginal and that my continued employment was likely contingent on abandoning the research directions I believed were necessary for genuine understanding of phenomena that security cameras were recording. I made a decision to document everything I'd learned and to prepare comprehensive materials that would preserve my research even if I was removed from the unit or if the increasing remnant activity led to developments that disrupted normal operations. I compiled all my data on active remnants, all my contact experiment documentation, all my interpretations and theories and the evidence that supported them, all my observations about the changing patterns in remnant behavior and what those changes might indicate about approaching developments. I stored this documentation in multiple locations, stored it in ways that would ensure its survival even if I was prevented from continuing my research, stored it with instructions for how future researchers could replicate my contact experiments and continue developing communication protocols, and use those protocols to verify or refute the interpretations I developed about what active remnants were and what they were doing in the city. And I prepared a final report for the unit leadership, prepared a comprehensive presentation of everything I'd learned through my unauthorized research, prepared to make one final attempt to convince them that active remnants were communicable maintenance entities that should be cooperated with rather than just observed, that the increasing remnant activity was a response to some genuine problem or situation that required attention, that the unit's passive observation approach was preventing us from understanding and potentially assisting with whatever these entities were preparing for. I scheduled a meeting with the unit director, presented my materials, explained my research and my findings and my concerns about the changing remnant patterns. The director listened without interrupting, reviewed my documentation carefully, considered my arguments seriously despite our previous conflicts about research methodologies. When I finished my presentation, there was a long silence while the director studied the data I'd compiled. While they reviewed the evidence I'd gathered through months of unauthorized contact experiments and analysis. Finally, they spoke, said they'd known I was conducting unauthorized research, said the unit had been monitoring my activities and had been aware of my contact experiments from early in their implementation, said they'd allowed me to continue because they were curious what I would discover, and because my theoretical work about active remnants being communicable entities had merit that deserved testing even if official policy prohibited such testing. They said my research had produced valuable data, had confirmed that active remnants were indeed different from standard remnants in ways that required different analytical approaches, had demonstrated that communication was possible even if the protocols I developed remained primitive and limited. They also said they'd been noticing the same changes in remnant behavior that I'd been documenting, said the unit had been tracking increasing activity levels and behavioral variations for several months, said my warning reports had been received seriously despite the official responses I'd received that suggested dismissal. The unit was concerned about these changes, was trying to understand what they indicated, was attempting to determine whether increasing remnant activity represented threat or opportunity or simply a natural variation in phenomena that we still didn't adequately understand despite years of observation and study. The director said they wanted to authorize my contact experiments officially, wanted to develop formal protocols based on the methods I developed, wanted to attempt systematic communication with active remnants to determine whether my interpretation of them as maintenance entities was accurate and whether they could provide information about what the increasing remnant activity indicated. This was reversal of the previous rejection of contact experiments, was acknowledgement that my research approach had produced results that observation alone couldn't achieve, was recognition that understanding these phenomena might require interaction rather than just documentation. I was reassigned back to active remnant research, was given resources and authority to develop comprehensive contact protocols, was authorized to conduct experiments that would attempt to establish clear communication with these entities and to use that communication to gather information about their nature and purpose and the changes occurring in remnant behavior across the city. I assembled a team of researchers who could assist with this work, who brought different expertise and perspectives to the challenge of communicating with entities that existed in different relationships to physical reality than humans did. We conducted systematic contact sessions across multiple facilities, documented active remnant responses to various communication approaches, gradually refined our protocols until we achieved more reliable and more substantive information exchange than my preliminary experiments had produced. We confirmed that active remnants were indeed maintenance entities, confirmed they operated throughout urban infrastructure conducting preservation and optimization work that supported human civilization even though humans remained unaware of their presence and contribution. And we learned what the warning had been about, learned what the increasing remnant activity indicated. The active remnants communicated that the systems they maintained were degrading, were approaching failure points that would cause cascading breakdowns across municipal infrastructure, were deteriorating in ways that human maintenance couldn't detect or address because the degradation was occurring in aspects of system function that human understanding of those systems didn't recognize or account for. The active remnants had been increasing their activities in response to this degradation, had been mobilizing additional resources and intensifying their maintenance efforts, had been attempting to prevent system failures that would affect the entire city. They communicated that they needed human cooperation, needed access to systems and components they couldn't reach through their normal operations, needed changes in how infrastructure was operated and maintained to address degradation they'd identified, but couldn't fully remediate without human assistance. The increasing standard remnant activity was a side effect of their intensified work, was consequence of their increased presence and activity making the spatial recording mechanism more active or more visible, was unintended but unavoidable result of their efforts to prevent infrastructure failures. We presented these findings to city administration, presented evidence that entities detectable by security cameras were conducting essential maintenance throughout municipal infrastructure, presented the case that these entities should be recognized and cooperated with rather than just observed and documented without acknowledgement. The response was skeptical, was resistant to accepting that invisible maintenance entities were operating in city facilities, was reluctant to make operational changes based on communications with phenomena that most administrators had never heard of and that sounded like science fiction rather than like legitimate municipal concerns. But the active remnants had provided specific predictions about where and when system failures would occur if their warnings weren't heeded, had given us detailed information about infrastructure vulnerabilities that we could verify through inspection and testing. We conducted those verifications, found that the degradation the entities had warned about was real and measurable, found that the failure predictions were accurate and that systems would indeed fail in the ways and timeframes the active remnants had communicated if corrective action wasn't taken. This evidence convinced administration to authorize the cooperation the active remnants had requested, authorize changes in maintenance protocols and system operations that would address the degradation they'd identified, authorized recognition of these entities as genuine contributors to municipal infrastructure rather than just as anomalous phenomena to be observed and studied. The cooperation was implemented gradually, was tested in limited facilities before being expanded citywide, was monitored carefully to verify it produced the benefits the active remnants had claimed it would produce. The results confirmed their claims, confirmed that the cooperative approach prevented the system failures they'd predicted, confirmed that their maintenance work was genuinely contributing to infrastructure function, and that supporting that work through human cooperation improved overall system reliability and performance. The city gradually developed comprehensive protocols for working with active remnants, gradually integrated recognition of these entities into normal infrastructure management, gradually acknowledged that municipal operations involved both human workers and invisible maintenance entities that cooperated to sustain the complex systems that supported urban life. The standard remnant activity decreased as the active remnants completed their intensified maintenance work, decreased as the infrastructure degradation was addressed and system failures were prevented, decreased back toward historical baseline levels, though never quite reaching those levels because the spatial recording mechanism had been permanently affected by the period of intensified activity. But the residual increase in standard remnant appearances wasn't concerning, wasn't problematic, was just a minor side effect of successful cooperation between human administration and the maintenance entities that security cameras had been recording for years before anyone understood what those recordings actually showed. I continued working with the unit, continued developing contact protocols and communication methods, continued serving as primary liaison between human infrastructure management and the active remnants that maintain systems throughout the city. It was strange work, was career path I never could have anticipated when I started as a simple archivist processing mundane municipal documentation, was role that existed in the gap between normal reality and the anomalous phenomena that security cameras detected but that had remained unacknowledged until someone took time to actually study what was being recorded. The security cameras had captured something that shouldn't exist according to consensus reality, had documented entities that moved and worked and communicated in ways that violated normal physical principles, had recorded presences that remained invisible to human perception but that were genuinely present in the city conducting essential work. And by studying those recordings carefully, by taking seriously the evidence that cameras were capturing something anomalous, by being willing to investigate beyond passive observation into actual communication and cooperation, we discovered that what security cameras recorded that shouldn't exist was actually something that needed to exist, was actually essential presence that made urban life possible, even though most people never knew these entities were there maintaining the systems that supported their daily lives. The cameras had seen what humans couldn't see, had documented what normal perception couldn't detect, had recorded evidence of reality that was more complex and stranger than official frameworks acknowledged. And by paying attention to what cameras recorded rather than dismissing it as malfunction or artifact or misperception, we'd expanded our understanding of what existed in the city, had recognized presences that deserved recognition, had established cooperation with entities that had been working alone to maintain systems that required both human administration and their invisible maintenance efforts to function properly. That's what security cameras had recorded, what I'd spent years studying and eventually learning to communicate with, what had transformed my career from simple archival work into something stranger and more significant than I'd ever imagined when I started processing backlog footage and noticed movement that didn't match normal expectations about how physical entities appeared in surveillance recordings. The cameras had recorded something that shouldn't exist, and by taking that recording seriously, I'd helped establish that it did exist and that its existence mattered and that cooperation with it was essential for the city to function properly. The entities that shouldn't exist but that cameras recorded were real, were present, were essential, were deserving of recognition and cooperation rather than just observation and documentation. The cameras had seen truly, had captured reality that human perception missed, had recorded evidence that expanded our understanding of what existed in the world we thought we knew completely. And I'd been the archivist who noticed what the cameras recorded, who investigated what it meant, who learned to communicate with what shouldn't exist but did exist, who helped establish recognition and cooperation that made both human operations and entity maintenance more effective through acknowledgement that both were necessary for complex systems to function properly.
I've been working as a statistical analyst for an insurance company for 11 years now, processing claims data and building actuarial models and identifying patterns in risk assessment that could inform underwriting decisions and premium calculations, spending my days immersed in spreadsheets and databases and the mathematical frameworks that transform individual incidents into aggregate probabilities, converting the chaos of human misfortune into predictable distributions that could be quantified and priced and incorporated into the rational structures of insurance operations. It's work that suits certain types of minds, work that requires comfort with abstraction and pattern recognition and the kind of thinking that sees individual events as data points rather than as human tragedies or personal catastrophes. Work that demands emotional distance from the suffering that generates the claims I analyze while maintaining rigorous attention to the statistical properties that make that suffering quantifiable and predictable across large populations. Most people can't achieve that balance, can't maintain the necessary detachment while also caring enough about accuracy to ensure their analyses are sound, can't separate the human reality of insurance claims from the mathematical reality of probability distributions. But I've always found statistical thinking natural, have always understood that patterns emerge from aggregation even when individual cases seem random, have always appreciated how mathematics could reveal structure in data that appeared chaotic when examined case by case but that showed clear regularities when analyzed properly across sufficient sample sizes. This orientation toward patterns and probabilities has served me well in insurance analytics, has allowed me to build models that improved our underwriting accuracy and reduced our loss ratios and generated measurable value for the company over years of consistent performance. I live alone in a small apartment in the outer suburbs, maintain minimal social connections beyond work relationships, spend my evenings much as I spend my days, analyzing data and building models and looking for patterns, though in my personal time I apply these skills to topics I find more interesting than insurance claims. Topics like sports statistics and financial markets and weather patterns and anything else that generates sufficient data to support rigorous analysis. I've never married, never had serious long-term relationships, never developed the kind of personal connections that seem to come naturally to most people but that have always felt like more effort than they were worth compared to the satisfaction I get from solitary analytical work. This background is relevant because what happened to me might not have happened to someone with different habits and different routines and different relationships to other people. Someone who lived less predictably, who had spouse or children or active social life, who didn't follow rigid schedules and consistent patterns might never have encountered what I encountered, might never have found themselves in circumstances where certain kinds of predictions became possible,
where the future could be documented with precision because that future was sufficiently constrained by habit and routine that it admitted minimal variation. I found the notebook on a Tuesday morning in October, found it on the subway seat beside me during my regular commute to the office, found it lying there as if someone had left it behind or as if it had been placed there deliberately for me to find. It was a plain black notebook, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, showed no distinguishing features or markings that might identify its owner or indicate what it contained. I wouldn't normally have picked it up, wouldn't normally have concerned myself with lost items on public transit, but something about it caught my attention, made me pick it up and open it before I consciously decided to do so. The notebook contained handwritten entries, contained what appeared to be a daily log or journal, contained dated entries describing activities and observations in the kind of detail that suggested either obsessive record-keeping or preparation of some kind of documentation for purposes I couldn't immediately determine. I flipped through several pages, reading entries at random, noting the precise timestamps and detailed descriptions of mundane activities, noting the systematic documentation of routine behaviors and minor decisions and the kind of everyday occurrences that most people wouldn't bother recording. Then I noticed the dates, noticed that the entries weren't from the past but from the future, noticed that the notebook was documenting tomorrow and the day after that and the following week and next month, noticed that what I was reading was purported documentation of events that hadn't yet occurred, was claimed record of future activities presented with the same matter-of-fact precision as historical records but referring to times that hadn't arrived yet in present chronology. I checked today's date against the entries, found the page that should correspond to today if this was genuine documentation of the future rather than some kind of joke or creative writing exercise. The entry for today described a morning routine that matched mine exactly, described my waking time and breakfast and commute details with precision that would be remarkable if this was prediction but that was unremarkable if this was documentation of actual occurrence. The entry described me finding a black notebook on the subway, described me opening it and reading it and noticing that it contained future entries, described me reaching the realization I was currently experiencing as I read this description of my current activity. I felt a deep disorientation that went beyond simple surprise at accurate prediction, felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of causality and time and the relationship between documentation and event. This notebook was describing what I was doing as I did it, was documenting my current experience from perspective of future completion, was presenting my present as past even though chronologically it was still occurring, was collapsing the distinction between documentation and prediction in ways that violated basic assumptions about how time and knowledge and causation functioned. I continued reading, read the entry's description of me continuing to read how I would check the next entry to see what I would do tomorrow, read my own future decisions being documented before I made them, read a narrative of my experience that was simultaneously prediction and description, was simultaneously before and after the events it documented. The entry predicted I would become obsessed with the notebook, would spend the rest of today's commute reading tomorrow's entry, would arrive at work distracted and unable to focus on my regular responsibilities, would spend the day thinking about the implications of finding documentation of my future rather than attending to my normal analytical work. I checked tomorrow's entry, found detailed description of my Wednesday activities, found documentation of routine that matched my normal patterns but that included specific variations I couldn't verify without living through tomorrow to see whether these predictions were accurate. The entry described me waking at my normal time, described my morning routine with the precision that characterized today's entry, described commute details and arrival at work in the first few hours of my Wednesday activities with specificity that suggested either genuine precognition or remarkably thorough knowledge of my habits and patterns. But tomorrow's entry also described variations from my normal routine, described me making decisions I wouldn't normally make, described me taking actions that deviated from my established patterns in ways that suggested tomorrow wouldn't simply replay my typical Wednesday but would incorporate changes prompted by my discovery of the notebook and my preoccupation with understanding what it represented. The entry described me attempting to verify its predictions, described me deliberately deviating from predicted activities to test whether the future it documented was fixed or whether I could change it through conscious choice to act differently than the notebook predicted. And the entry described these attempted deviations failing, described me finding myself unable to make choices that contradicted the documented future, described the experience of discovering that knowing what I would do tomorrow didn't give me power to change what I would do, described the progressive realization that the notebook wasn't predicting my future but was documenting it from perspective of already having occurred, was describing what would happen with certainty that came from it. Already having happened in some temporal framework that existed parallel to or outside of normal chronological progression. I spent the rest of my commute reading tomorrow's entry repeatedly, analyzing the specific predictions it made, identifying points where I could test its accuracy, planning how I would verify whether this notebook genuinely documented my future or whether it was elaborate coincidence or trick that just happened to describe my routine with remarkable accuracy. I arrived at work distracted exactly as the entry had predicted, found myself unable to focus on my regular analytical work exactly as the documentation had described, spent the day obsessing about the notebook exactly as tomorrow's entry said I had spent today obsessing after finding it. This meta-quality of the predictions was particularly unsettling, the way the notebook documented not just my actions but my reactions to the notebook itself, the way it described my attempts to understand it and my plans to test it and my emotional responses to discovering it, the way it presented my experience of engaging with the predictions as itself predicted, as itself documented from future perspective that had already observed me going through exactly what I was currently going through. It created a closed loop of documentation and experience where I couldn't distinguish between doing things because I chose to do them and doing things because the notebook predicted I would do them, couldn't separate my agency from the documented future that presented my choices as already made. I went home that evening following the routine the notebook had described, made the dinner it predicted I would make, watched the television program it said I would watch, went to bed at the time it documented, lived through Tuesday evening exactly as tomorrow's entry said I had lived through it when documenting my Wednesday activities from perspective of already knowing what I'd done on Tuesday. The precision was perfect, the predictions were flawless. The documentation matched my experience exactly as if I were reading a historical record of what had occurred rather than a prediction of what would occur. Wednesday morning I woke determined to deviate from the predicted routine, determined to prove that the future wasn't fixed simply because it had been documented, determined to demonstrate that I retained agency and choice despite the notebook's apparent certainty about what I would do. I planned to skip breakfast though the entry predicted I would eat my normal meal, planned to take a different subway line though the entry predicted I would take my usual route, planned to arrive at work early though the entry predicted I would arrive at my standard time. But I found myself unable to execute these deviations, found myself making breakfast despite my intention to skip it, found myself walking to my usual subway line despite my plan to take the alternate route, found myself arriving at work at my normal time despite my determination to arrive early. The deviations failed not because anything prevented me from making different choices but because circumstances and minor decisions and the accumulated momentum of routine combined to produce exactly the outcomes the notebook had predicted, combined to prevent my attempted changes from actually manifesting despite my conscious intention to act differently than the documentation described. I forgot about my intention to skip breakfast until after I'd already started eating, got distracted while walking to the subway and ended up at my usual line without consciously deciding to go there, encountered delays that prevented early arrival at work despite my having left my apartment with sufficient time. The notebook's predictions held not because they constrained my choices but because they anticipated exactly how my attempts to deviate would fail, anticipated the specific ways circumstances would prevent me from actually changing my routine despite my conscious determination to do so. This was more disturbing than if the predictions had been enforced by some external constraint, was more unsettling than if I'd found myself physically unable to deviate from documented future. Because the notebook's accuracy came from perfect knowledge of how I would fail to change my behavior rather than from any mechanism that forced me to follow its predictions, came from understanding my patterns and decision-making and the ways routine and habit and minor circumstantial factors would combine to produce predicted outcomes despite my conscious attempts to choose differently. I checked tomorrow's entry again during Wednesday, found it still described Thursday activities with the same precision and certainty, found it predicted I would spend Thursday trying to find information about the notebook's origin, would spend the day searching for previous owners or explanations for how it came to contain accurate documentation of my future, would attempt to understand the mechanism by which my activities were being predicted with perfect accuracy days before they occurred. Thursday I did exactly what the entry predicted, spent the day investigating the notebook rather than working, searched for any identifying information that might indicate who had created it or how they had acquired such detailed knowledge of my routines and patterns. The notebook contained no ownership information, no names or contact details or any indication of who had written the entries or how they had known what to write. The handwriting was consistent throughout all entries, was clearly from single author, was neat and precise in ways that suggested careful documentation rather than hasty note-taking. I checked future entries again, read ahead through weeks and months of documented activities, found that the notebook covered approximately 6 months of my future, ended in mid-April with an entry that stopped mid-sentence as if the documentation had been interrupted or as if whatever mechanism generated these predictions couldn't see beyond that point. The entries throughout this 6-month period maintained the same detailed precision, documented my daily routines and decisions and experiences with accuracy that suggested either perfect knowledge of my future or perfect understanding of my patterns sufficient to predict my activities across extended time frame. I looked for variations in the predicted future, looked for documented decisions that differed from my normal patterns, looked for evidence that my future would contain changes or developments beyond simple continuation of existing routine. But the entries described largely unchanging existence, described me continuing my regular work and my solitary evenings and my analytical hobbies without significant variation, described 6 months of life that looked essentially identical to the past 6 months and the 6 months before that, described future that was almost perfectly predictable because my present was almost perfectly routine. This realization was depressing in ways that went beyond my concerns about the notebook's predictions, was confrontation with how thoroughly my life had become pattern rather than dynamic experience, was recognition that 6 months of my future could be documented with precision because those 6 months would contain minimal variation from established routines, would involve minimal genuine choice or spontaneous decision or anything that couldn't be predicted from understanding my habits and preferences and the constrained set of activities that constituted my regular existence. But there were small variations in the documented future, were minor deviations that suggested the 6 months wouldn't be completely identical to previous 6-month periods, were subtle differences that indicated something would change even if that change was minor and gradual rather than dramatic or transformative. The entries described me becoming progressively more isolated, described me reducing my already minimal social contacts, described me spending increasing amounts of time alone with the notebook, described obsessive focus on understanding its predictions replacing even the limited engagement I normally maintained with other people and external activities. And the entries described this progression as if it were inevitable, as if my trajectory toward increasing isolation was as predictable and fixed as my daily routines, As if the notebook's documentation of my gradual withdrawal from remaining social connections was reliable prediction rather than just possible outcome that I could avoid through conscious effort to maintain relationships and engagement despite my preoccupation with understanding the documented future. I decided to test this, decided to actively maintain social connections that the notebook predicted I would let lapse, decided to prove that long-term predictions were less reliable than short-term documentation of daily routine, decided to demonstrate that I retained agency over major life patterns even if I couldn't change tomorrow's breakfast or commute route. I contacted colleagues I normally avoided socializing with, arranged dinners and activities that represented deviations from my usual solitary evenings, deliberately created social obligations that would prevent the isolation the notebook predicted. But these attempts failed in the same way my attempts to change daily routine had failed not because I was prevented from making social plans but because those plans consistently fell through, consistently got cancelled or rescheduled or undermined by circumstances that combined to prevent them from actually occurring. Colleagues got sick or had emergencies or forgot about scheduled meetings. My own minor illnesses or work obligations or simple fatigue led me to cancel plans I'd made. The accumulated effect of multiple small failures was that the social connections I'd tried to maintain dissolved exactly as the notebook had predicted they would dissolve. I spent weeks attempting to deviate from the documented future, attempting to prove that predictions made weeks in advance couldn't be as reliable as predictions about tomorrow's activities, attempting to demonstrate that I could change my trajectory through conscious effort even if I couldn't change individual daily routines. But everything I tried failed, everything I attempted to change resulted in exactly the outcomes the notebook had predicted. Everything I did to avoid the documented future just became part of the mechanism by which that future was realized exactly as described. The notebook predicted my attempts to change my life, predicted my failures to make those changes stick, predicted my progressive resignation to living according to documented future because that future proved impossible to alter despite my understanding that it hadn't occurred yet. Despite my knowledge that chronologically I still had time to make different choices that would produce different outcomes. But that knowledge was useless. That chronological priority of present over future provided no actual power to change what would happen, provided only the experience of living through predicted events with full awareness that they had been documented before they occurred. I became obsessed with the endpoint of the documentation, became focused on the entry from mid-April where the predictions ended mid-sentence, became convinced that this endpoint represented something significant, represented either a limitation in the prediction mechanism or represented something happening to me that prevented further documentation. The final entry described a normal Wednesday, described me waking and going to work and beginning routine analysis tasks, described the first few hours of the day with typical precision, then stopped abruptly in the middle of a sentence describing what I was working on at my desk. I couldn't determine what this abrupt ending meant, couldn't distinguish between mundane explanations like the person writing these predictions simply stopping their documentation and disturbing explanations like something happening to me that prevented my future from extending beyond that Wednesday in April, couldn't tell whether the endpoint represented limitation of the notebook or endpoint of my existence. I spent increasing amounts of time analyzing this final entry, looking for clues about what happened after the sentence broke off, looking for any indication of whether my future continued beyond the documented period or whether the documentation ended because my future ended. This preoccupation was itself documented in the notebook, was predicted in entries describing me becoming obsessed with the final entry, was part of the predicted progression toward isolation and fixation that the notebook described occurring over the 6-month period between finding it in October and reaching the April endpoint. I was living according to predictions that included my obsession with those predictions, was following documented future that described me attempting to understand the documented future, was caught in recursive loop where my engagement with the notebook was part of what the notebook predicted. I tried to share the notebook with others, tried to show colleagues or acquaintances the predictions and their accuracy, tried to get external perspective on what I was experiencing and what the documentation might mean. But when I attempted to show the notebook to other people, I found that they couldn't see the entries the way I saw them, found that when others looked at the pages they saw only blank paper, found that the predictions were visible only to me, found that whatever mechanism made the notebook display its documentation was specific to my observation, was targeted to me personally rather than being objective text that anyone could read. This selectivity of visibility was itself predicted in the notebook, was documented in entries that described my attempts to share the predictions and my discovery that others couldn't see them, was part of the comprehensive documentation that seemed to anticipate everything I would do in response to finding this notebook and discovering its accurate predictions. I couldn't escape the predictions through sharing them, couldn't dilute their power through getting external validation or support, couldn't make the experience less isolating by involving others in understanding what was happening to me. The entries described my progressive psychological deterioration, described increasing anxiety and depression as I approached the April endpoint, described my functionality declining as I became more focused on the predictions and less capable of maintaining my work performance and basic self-care. The documentation was clinical and precise, documented my decline with the same matter-of-fact tone as it documented my daily routines, presented my approaching breakdown as predictable outcome of finding the notebook and being unable to change the future it documented. I tried to destroy the notebook, tried to eliminate it as a way of escaping its predictions, tried burning it and shredding it and disposing of it in various ways that should have permanently removed it from my possession. But the notebook proved indestructible, proved impossible to damage or dispose of, proved resistant to all my attempts to eliminate it. Fire wouldn't burn it, shredding equipment wouldn't tear it, disposal services wouldn't take it, every attempt to destroy it failed, and I found the notebook returned to my possession regardless of what I did to try to permanently separate myself from it. And these attempts were themselves predicted, were documented in entries that described me trying to destroy the notebook and failing, were part of the comprehensive record of my 6-month experience with predictions that I couldn't escape or change or avoid by eliminating the documentation that described them. I was trapped in predicted future that included my attempts to escape that future, was living through documented experience that anticipated all my responses to being documented. I stopped going to work in February, stopped maintaining even minimal professional responsibilities, stopped engaging with anything beyond the notebook in my obsessive analysis of its predictions and my increasingly desperate attempts to find some variation between documented future and actual experience that would prove I retained some capacity to change what would happen. But there were no variations, the predictions remained perfect. Everything occurred exactly as documented regardless of my awareness that it had been predicted, regardless of my intention to choose differently, regardless of my understanding that the future shouldn't be fixed simply because it had been written down before it occurred. The entries described my financial problems as I stopped earning income, described my eviction from my apartment as I stopped paying rent, described my progressive homelessness as predicted consequences of my documented decline materialized exactly as the notebook said they would materialize. I tried to prevent these outcomes, tried to maintain employment and housing despite the predictions, tried to demonstrate that major life disruptions weren't as inevitable as daily routines, tried to prove that I could avoid documented disasters even if I couldn't change documented reckless choices. But the predictions held, the documentation proved accurate, the future unfolded exactly as described despite my desperate efforts to alter its course. I lost my job when my performance declined exactly as predicted, got evicted when I couldn't pay rent exactly as documented, became homeless exactly on the timeline the notebook had specified months earlier when I'd first read these entries and had believed I could avoid these outcomes through conscious effort to maintain my life despite finding predictions of its collapse. I spent March living according to documented routine of homelessness, spent my days in libraries and public spaces exactly as the entries predicted, spent my nights in shelters or on streets exactly as the documentation described, lived through poverty and degradation that the notebook had mapped out months before it occurred, lived through predicted decline with full awareness that every step of this deterioration had been documented before it began but with no power to prevent any of it from occurring exactly as described. The entries continued to be perfectly accurate through all of this, continued to document my experience with precision that didn't diminish even as my circumstances became more chaotic and less routine, continued to predict my daily activities and decisions and experiences even as those activities became less constrained by regular schedule and stable housing, continued to demonstrate that my future was knowable regardless of how unpredictable my circumstances appeared. As I approached the April endpoint, I became convinced that the final entry's abrupt ending represented my death, became certain that the documentation stopped mid-sentence because I would die during that Wednesday in April, became focused on preventing that outcome even though I've been unable to prevent any other predicted outcome throughout the 6 months since finding the notebook. I made plans to avoid whatever situation the final entry described, made preparations to ensure I wouldn't be at work on that Wednesday doing the activities the documentation predicted, made every effort to create circumstances where the final entry's predictions couldn't possibly be accurate. But when that Wednesday arrived, I found myself at the public library where I'd been spending my days, found myself sitting at a computer doing exactly the kind of activity the final entry had described even though it had described me being at work rather than being homeless in the library, found that the prediction's accuracy held even though my circumstances had changed from what they'd been when I first read that entry. The final sentence described me working on analysis tasks, described me focused on data patterns, described me engaged with exactly the kind of work I'd been doing at my job before losing it, described activity that made sense only if I were still employed but that I found myself doing anyway because I couldn't help myself from engaging with analytical work even in my current circumstances. And then I reached the point where the sentence ended, reached the exact moment that the documentation stopped mid-word, reached the end point of predicted future with full awareness that this moment had been specified months earlier but with no understanding of what happened next, with no knowledge of whether I continued beyond this point or whether the documentation ended because my existence ended. I sat there waiting for whatever would happen at the end point, waiting to see if I would die or if the predictions would simply stop or if something else entirely would occur that I hadn't anticipated. Nothing happened. The moment passed, I continued existing, the predicted endpoint arrived and was unremarkable, was just another moment in continued existence rather than being dramatic termination or significant transition. I sat at the library computer feeling confused and relieved, feeling that I'd passed some threshold without understanding what that threshold had represented, feeling that the nightmare of living according to perfect predictions might be ending because the documentation had run out. I checked the notebook, opened it to see if any new entries had appeared beyond the April endpoint, looked to see if the predictions continued now that I'd reached the end of the original documentation. The pages after the final entry were blank, showed no new predictions, suggested that whatever mechanism had created the documented future had indeed stopped with that Wednesday in April, suggested that my future beyond that point was undocumented and unknown. But as I looked at these blank pages I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, noticed that what appeared blank from direct examination showed faint impressions when viewed at certain angles, showed ghostly text that was almost invisible but that became barely readable under specific lighting conditions and viewing angles. I adjusted my position, adjusted the notebook's orientation, gradually made this hidden text more visible, gradually revealed that the blank pages weren't actually blank but contained another layer of documentation that had been invisible until I reached the endpoint of the primary predictions. This hidden documentation was different from the original entries, was written in different hand, used different tone and style, appeared to be meta-commentary on the primary predictions rather than being predictions itself. I read through this hidden text carefully, trying to understand what it was and what relationship it had to the predictions I'd been living through for 6 months. The hidden text explained that the notebook was a test, explained that the predictions had been generated to observe how I would respond to knowing my future, explained that everything I'd experienced had been an experiment designed to study human behavior under conditions of perfect precognition. The text explained that the predictions had been created by analyzing my patterns and routines, explained that the accuracy came from sophisticated modeling of my behavior rather than from genuine knowledge of future, explained that what I'd experienced as predetermined future had actually been sophisticated prediction based on deep understanding of my psychology and habits. The text explained that my inability to change predicted outcomes had resulted from the predictions being so accurate that they anticipated exactly how I would fail to deviate from documented routine, explained that I could have changed my future if I'd been willing to make sufficiently radical changes that would break the behavioral patterns the predictions were based on, explained that my failure to escape predicted future had resulted from my unwillingness or inability to make changes. Dramatic enough to invalidate the predictive model. And the text explained that the experiment was over, explained that I'd reached the endpoint because the predictive model couldn't be extended beyond 6 months with sufficient accuracy to maintain the illusion of perfect precognition, explained that continuing the predictions would have required ongoing observation and modeling that wasn't sustainable beyond the initial period. The text thanked me for my participation in the experiment, described the valuable data my responses had generated, explained that the documentation I'd lived through would contribute to better understanding of how humans respond to knowledge of their future. I sat there processing this explanation, trying to determine whether it was true or whether it was another layer of manipulation, trying to understand whether I'd actually been living according to sophisticated predictions based on behavioral modeling or whether this explanation was false comfort meant to make me believe I'd never actually been constrained by predetermined future. The explanation was itself suspect, was exactly the kind of rationalization I would want to believe after 6 months of living according to predictions I couldn't change, was perfectly designed to restore sense of agency and free will that the predictions had undermined. But whether the explanation was true or false, whether the predictions had been behavioral modeling or genuine precognition, whether I'd been subject to experiment or had been experiencing actually predetermined future, the practical reality was that I'd lost 6 months of my life, had lost my job and my housing and my stability, had experienced exactly the decline the notebook had documented regardless of what mechanism had generated that documentation. The question of whether predictions had been technically accurate foreknowledge versus merely very sophisticated guesses made no practical difference to the outcomes I'd experienced. I closed the notebook and left it on the library table, walked away from it for the first time since finding it, chose to abandon it rather than keeping it with me as I had for the previous 6 months. I didn't know if this choice represented genuine agency or if it was itself predicted by some model I wasn't aware of, didn't know if walking away was my decision or if it was anticipated response that whoever created the predictions expected me to make once I reached the endpoint and discovered the hidden text. But I walked away anyway, left the notebook behind, chose to treat the endpoint as genuine ending even if I couldn't be certain whether my future beyond that point was genuinely undocumented or whether there were further layers of prediction I hadn't discovered yet, whether the apparent end of predictions was real or was itself part of more complex documentation that I hadn't been shown. I walked away because continuing to engage with the notebook seemed pointless regardless of whether its predictions had been genuine or fabricated, regardless of whether I'd experienced real predetermination or sophisticated manipulation. I spent the following weeks trying to rebuild, trying to recover from the decline the notebook had documented and that I had lived through regardless of the mechanism that had made that documentation accurate. I sought employment, sought housing, sought to reconstruct some version of the stable routine I'd maintained before finding predictions of my future. The process was difficult, was complicated by 6-month gap in employment and by homelessness and by need to explain what had happened during the period in ways that wouldn't sound insane to potential employers or landlords. But I made progress, gradually re-established minimal stability, gradually built new routine that resembled my previous life in broad structure while being different in specifics. Gradually returned to something approximating normal existence even though my experience with the notebook had permanently changed my relationship to my own routines and habits and the predictability that had made me vulnerable to accurate documentation of my future. I remained uncertain about what I'd actually experienced, remained unable to determine definitively whether the notebook had contained genuine predictions or sophisticated behavioral modeling, remained caught between competing interpretations of what had happened and what it meant about free will and determinism and the relationship between knowledge of future and power to change that future. The hidden text's explanation was plausible but not definitely true. The original prediction's accuracy was remarkable but not necessarily evidence of actual precognition. My experience was disturbing but not conclusive about fundamental questions of whether future was fixed or changeable. I tried to research whether others had found similar notebooks, tried to determine whether my experience was unique or part of larger pattern, tried to find evidence that would confirm whether the notebook had been experiment or genuine anomaly. But I found nothing, found no reports of similar experiences, found no evidence that anyone else had encountered documentation of their future or had lived through the kind of predicted decline I'd experienced, found no external validation that might help me interpret what had happened to me. I considered the possibility that my entire experience had been hallucination, considered that the notebook might never have existed except in my own mind, considered that I might have experienced 6 months of progressive mental illness that manifested as belief in predictions while the actual mechanism of my decline was psychological deterioration rather than documented future becoming actual present. This interpretation explained everything I'd experienced while preserving conventional understanding of time and causality and free will, explained the notebook's apparent indestructibility as feature of hallucination rather than actual property of physical object, explained the selective visibility as symptom of mental illness rather than as genuine characteristic of anomalous artifact. But this interpretation felt like rationalization as much as the hidden text's explanation had felt like rationalization, felt like comfortable story I was telling myself to avoid confronting more disturbing possibilities, felt like retreat into conventional frameworks rather than genuine engagement with the question of what I'd actually experienced. I had the lived memory of 6 months with the notebook, had the experienced reality of predictions being perfectly accurate, had the concrete outcomes of decline that had occurred exactly as documented regardless of my efforts to prevent it. Whether those memories and experiences represented engagement with actual predictions or represented symptoms of mental illness or represented participation in behavioral experiment, the subjective reality is that I'd lived through something that felt like perfect knowledge of my future combined with perfect inability to change that future, had experienced what it was like to know what I would do tomorrow while being unable to do anything different, had confronted the question of whether I retained agency and free will in ways that most people never have to confront because most people don't encounter documentation of their future that proves accurate across extended time frames. I gradually stopped trying to definitively answer these questions, gradually accepted that I might never know for certain what the notebook had been or what my experience would have meant, gradually focused on practical reality of rebuilding my life rather than on theoretical questions about the nature of the predictions I'd lived through. I developed new routines that were deliberately different from my pre-notebook patterns, developed habits that incorporated conscious variation rather than rigid consistency, developed lifestyle that was less predictable because I'd learned that perfect predictability made perfect prediction possible regardless of the mechanism by which that prediction was achieved. I avoided statistical work, avoided activities that focused on patterns and predictions and the kind of analytical thinking that had defined my professional life before finding the notebook, avoided engagement with frameworks that treated future as knowable through analysis of past patterns, avoided the worldview that had made me vulnerable to accurate documentation of my future, whether that documentation came from genuine precognition or from sophisticated behavioral modeling or from my own mind-generating hallucinated predictions that I then fulfilled through unconscious compulsion. I took a job in physical labor, took work that engaged body rather than mind, took position that required presence and effort rather than analysis and prediction, took employment that couldn't be accurately predicted because it involved responding to variable demands rather than following consistent routine, took work that made me less predictable because it made my future less determined by established patterns. The job paid less than my previous analytical work, required different skills, involved different lifestyle, represented significant change from the stable professional routine I'd maintained for years before finding the notebook. But this change felt necessary, felt like appropriate response to experience that had demonstrated the dangers of excessive routine and predictability, felt like reasonable adaptation to having learned that my future could be documented with precision when my present was sufficiently constrained by habit and pattern. I couldn't return to the kind of rigidly routine existence I'd maintained before the notebook, couldn't accept the vulnerability that came with being perfectly predictable, couldn't risk experiencing again what I'd experienced during those 6 months of living according to documented future. Years passed, I maintained my new lifestyle. I avoided falling into the kind of rigid patterns that had characterized my previous existence. I stayed alert to the possibility that I might encounter another notebook or another form of prediction or another manifestation of whatever I'd experienced during those 6 months. But nothing similar occurred, no new predictions appeared, no documentation of my future emerged to suggest that what I'd experienced was ongoing condition rather than isolated incident. I remained changed by the experience, remained unable to trust that my choices were genuinely free even when I made deliberate efforts to vary my behavior and avoid predictable patterns, remained haunted by the question of whether I'd been living according to predetermined future or according to accurate predictions based on behavioral modeling or according to hallucinated documentation that I'd unconsciously fulfilled. The uncertainty was permanent, was question I would never definitively answer, was ambiguity I had to accept as fundamental feature of my experience with the notebook. Sometimes I wondered if I'd made the right choice by walking away from the notebook at the library, wondered if I should have kept it to study it further or to seek additional explanations for what it had been and what it meant, wondered if abandoning it had been necessary for my recovery or had been a mistake that prevented me from understanding what I'd actually experienced. But I couldn't return to find it even if I wanted to, couldn't locate it again because I deliberately avoided returning to that library, couldn't retrieve it because I didn't know if it had been a real object that might still be sitting where I left it or hallucinated artifact that never existed in any location I could return to. I learned to live with these uncertainties, learned to accept that my experience with the notebook would remain fundamentally ambiguous, learned to function despite not knowing whether I'd encountered genuine prediction or sophisticated manipulation or my own mind generating disturbing experience that felt like external reality, but that might have been entirely internal. I learned that some questions don't have definitive answers, that some experiences resist clear interpretation, that some encounters with apparent anomalies remain forever uncertain in their nature and meaning and implications. The notebook had predicted everything I would do for 6 months, had documented my future with perfect accuracy, had shown me what knowledge of tomorrow looked like when that knowledge was comprehensive and precise and completely reliable. Whether that documentation came from genuine precognition or from behavioral modeling or from hallucination, whether the predictions were actually accurate foreknowledge or merely sophisticated analysis that anticipated my responses with remarkable precision, The experience had changed me in ways that couldn't be undone by discovering explanations or by abandoning the notebook or by rebuilding my life according to different patterns. I found myself thinking about the notebook at unexpected moments, found myself wondering whether my current choices were genuinely free or whether they too were constrained by patterns I couldn't perceive, found myself questioning whether my deliberate efforts to introduce variation into my life represented actual freedom or just different form of predictability, whether my response to the notebook had itself been predictable consequence of my personality and circumstances and the specific ways I had engaged with the predictions. The recursive quality of these thoughts mirrored the recursive quality of the notebook's predictions, created similar sense of being trapped in loop where every attempt to escape or understand just became part of larger pattern that I couldn't see from my position inside it. I developed new relationships during the years after the notebook, developed connections that were more substantial than the minimal social contacts I'd maintained before finding it, developed friendships and eventually romantic relationship that represented genuine departure from my previous isolation. These relationships felt like evidence of change, felt like proof that I'd escaped the predictable patterns that had characterized my life before the notebook, felt like demonstration that I could choose differently and create different outcomes through conscious effort and deliberate engagement with other people. But I couldn't fully trust these relationships either, couldn't completely believe that they represented genuine change rather than just different manifestation of underlying patterns, couldn't escape suspicion that even my most spontaneous choices and my most authentic connections might be predictable if someone understood me well enough, might be documentable in advance if someone had sufficient knowledge of my psychology and circumstances and the ways I would respond to various situations. The notebook had taught me that predictability went deeper than I'd imagined, that patterns persisted even when I thought I was making free choices, that my future could be known because my present was more constrained than I wanted to believe. This awareness made me more conscious of my choices, made me more deliberate about my decisions, made me more attentive to moments where I might be falling into patterns or following habits without conscious intention. I questioned my impulses, analyzed my motivations, examined my routines for signs that they were becoming too rigid or too predictable, maintained vigilance against the kind of thoroughgoing predictability that had made me vulnerable to the notebook's perfect predictions. This vigilance was exhausting, required constant attention and effort, made spontaneity difficult because every spontaneous choice raised questions about whether it was genuinely spontaneous or whether it was predictable response that someone who understood me well could have anticipated. My partner noticed this quality in me, noticed my tendency to question my own choices and to analyze my own behavior and to maintain distance from my own experiences as if I were observing them from outside rather than living through them directly. She asked about it, asked what had happened to make me so suspicious of my own agency, asked why I seemed unable to trust that my choices were my own. I tried to explain about the notebook, tried to describe the experience of living according to perfect predictions, tried to convey what it had been like to know my future and to find myself unable to change it despite that knowledge. She listened to my explanation with concern and skepticism, listened to my description of the notebook and the predictions and the 6 months of documented decline, listened to my account of the hidden text and the claimed experiment and my uncertainty about what had actually happened. She suggested gently that the notebook might have been hallucination, suggested that I might have experienced episode of mental illness that I'd interpreted as encounter with anomalous object, suggested that I should consider therapy to help process what I'd experienced and to address the ongoing impact it was having on my ability to trust my own choices and to live without constant self-analysis. I considered her suggestions seriously, considered the possibility that professional help might give me tools to integrate my experience and to function without the exhausting vigilance I'd maintained since leaving the notebook behind. I made appointments with therapists, attempted to describe what I'd experienced to professionals who might help me understand it, attempted to get external perspective on whether my interpretation of events was reasonable or whether it represented distorted thinking that required correction. But the therapists I spoke with had difficulty engaging with my experience on its own terms, had tendency to immediately categorize it as delusion or hallucination or break from reality, had difficulty considering the possibility that I might have actually encountered something anomalous rather than having experienced purely psychological phenomena. Their interpretations felt reductive in ways that mirrored the hidden text's explanation, felt like comfortable frameworks that explained away the disturbing aspects of my experience rather than genuinely engaging with the questions it raised about prediction and free will and the relationship between knowledge and agency. I stopped seeing therapists after several unsuccessful attempts to find someone who could help me integrate my experience without simply dismissing it as mental illness. I recognized that whether the notebook had been real or hallucinated, whether the predictions had been genuine or delusion, the psychological impact was the same. The questions it raised about agency and predictability were equally valid regardless of the objective status of the notebook itself. But I couldn't find professional help that acknowledged this, couldn't find therapists who could work with my experience as I'd actually lived it rather than as it fit into their diagnostic categories and treatment frameworks. Instead, I found myself returning to the question of whether other people might have had similar experiences, returned to searching for evidence of others who had encountered predictions of their future or who had lived through the kind of documented existence I'd experienced. I searched online forums and obscure websites and collections of anomalous experiences, searched for any indication that the notebook had been part of larger phenomenon rather than isolated incident or personal hallucination, searched for validation that might confirm that what I'd experienced had some reality beyond my own mind.